Hey guys, tonight we're going to talk about things that were so wildly misused, abused, or downright botched by just one person that the whole thing got banned. Yep, someone somewhere in the Middle Ages had a moment, a very special, very chaotic moment, and it was enough to ruin it for absolutely everybody else. And yes, you probably won't survive this timeline, because if medieval society had Yelp, most of these entries would be tagged "Do not return" in all caps. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also drop your city and what time it is right now in the comments. I love seeing where everyone's listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're walking through the narrow, muddy streets of 14th century London. The air's a cocktail of wood smoke, horse sweat, and that one distinct medieval smell nobody ever talks about in fairy tales. Let's just call it old soup. You're watching your feet because you don't want to step into something unspeakable. But then something weirder catches your eye. Shoes. Specifically, pointy shoes. Comically long, almost weaponized, curling up like an elf's nightmare. These are Krakows and they are everywhere. Nobles are flaunting them like status symbols, the tips of their shoes practically poking people in the eye as they walk. The longer the toe, the richer the owner, because apparently wealth is measured in how little you need to walk like a normal person, and that's when you spot the man who ruined it all, Sir Geoffrey of Cornwall. Local lord walking around like he's got skis strapped to his feet, his Krakows so long they have to be tied to his thighs with little golden chains to keep from tripping over them. He thinks he looks regal. He does not. He looks like a parody of a flamingo that got into the royal dressing room. Geoffrey wasn't content with just absurd shoes. He turned them into a political statement. At court, he used the extra length to subtly jab rivals under the table during discussions, literally poking his way through diplomacy. Once, he used his shoes to trip a foreign envoy from Castile during a feast. The envoy fell face first into a roasted boar and threatened to sever all trade ties unless the shoe problem was addressed. Royal embarrassment doesn't even begin to cover it, but Geoffrey's pièce de résistance? A royal wedding. He showed up wearing Krakows so long that two squires had to walk ahead of him, holding the tips like train bearers for a bridal gown. One of the squires tripped, crashed into the bride's father, and knocked over the cake, a sugar-spun miracle of medieval baking gone. The chaos was glorious. Geoffrey, of course, laughed. The king did not. It wasn't just the court either. Peasants tried to imitate the fashion with the knockoff Krakows, which resulted in more injuries, more falling into wells, more stepping on farm animals. Town criers started reporting shoe-related accidents weekly. Doctors, or what passed for them, warned of toe misalignment and chronic tip-foot disease, which is probably not a real thing, but medieval people believed in leech therapy, so let's not hold them to modern standards. Eventually, enough was enough. In 1463, King Edward IV declared war, not on a country, not on a plague, but on shoes. Specifically, he banned any Krakow-style footwear with toes extending over 2 inches beyond the natural foot. Anything longer was subject to fines, public shaming, or confiscation. That's right, the royal guards could now arrest your shoes. Historically, this moment marked a rare royal crackdown on fashion, a full-blown footnote in sumptuary law history. But here's the quirky bit. While noblemen were being fined, some court jesters were still allowed to wear them as a joke, so Geoffrey's legacy didn't disappear entirely. It just became a punchline. Now here's the debate. Was it really just about shoes? Some scholars argue the ban wasn't about Krakows at all, but what they represented. The Middle Ages had a deep fear of vanity, and long shoes were interpreted as a phallic symbol. Yes, even back then people were weirdly obsessed with that kind of symbolism. Church officials called the shoes devilish, and accused wearers of stepping too far into sin. So was this about fashion diplomacy, or just good old religious guilt? Nobody agrees. What is agreed upon is this. One man, too much flair, and a medieval kingdom said, nope, absolutely not. Geoffrey lived out the rest of his days sulking in short-toed shame, while cobblers across Europe quietly grieved their lost income. And so the next time you slip on a pair of shoes, without needing to tether the toes to your thighs, thank King Edward, and curse Geoffrey of Cornwall. You're sitting quietly at a long, polished oak table, the scent of candle wax and old parchment drifting through the cathedral-like hall around you. It's chilly. Those thick stone walls trap the cold like a forgotten dungeon, and the air is tense. because technically you're just here to watch some monks play chess. Peaceful, right? Nope, it's about to go very wrong. See, you're watching the game that got chess banned in half the holy offices of Europe for a generation. And it all comes down to one overly clever bishop, not the chess piece, the actual bishop. His name is Cardinal Hugo de Vienne, and he's a man of the cloth with the soul of a chaos gremlin. Now, chess in the Middle Ages wasn't the casual game we know today. It was an elite pastime, the kind of thing that suggested you were smart, strategic, and not needed in the fields. The church even encouraged it at first. Mentally stimulating, morally clean, and no dice involved. So no gambling, theoretically. But Hugo had ideas. At first, his chess games were legendary because of his skill. People travelled from other parishes just to watch him humiliate nobles in silent, methodical destruction. But then he started making statements. Subtle ones, like switching the queen's placement on the board when playing against visiting dignitaries, calling it symbolic of new gender roles in the kingdom of God, or using the pawns to spell messages in Latin. Some of them were not scripture. Then came the real scandal, the conspiracy game. It started in Avignon during a particularly drawn-out papal schism. Tensions were high, allegiances fragile. Hugo invited a dozen guests, clerics, scholars, and a few ambitious nobles to his chambers for a private demonstration of spiritual warfare through chess. Sounds harmless, right? Except, halfway through the game, the positioning of the pieces on the board spelled out a direct visual metaphor for the Pope's corruption and predicted his downfall in 16 moves. Someone laughed, someone else gasped, someone took notes. Word spread, fast. Within a week, the church launched an internal inquiry. Not only had Hugo turned chess into a literal vehicle for political rebellion, he'd reportedly used it to plan an actual attempt to sway the election of the next pope. Not with weapons, mind you, with metaphor and strategy. But that was enough. The ban came swiftly. Bishops and cardinals across France and Italy declared chess a game of pride and subversion. In monasteries, boards were burned. In some abbeys, they nailed the pieces to the church doors with labels like vanity and arrogance. Playing chess was declared a punishable offence in several religious orders. Monks who had once spent their evenings bent over pawns were reassigned to tasks like latrine maintenance or sheep shearing. Very humbling stuff. Here's your quirky fact. In one particularly zealous order in Burgundy, monks were only allowed to play checkers because it had fewer pieces, no queen, and didn't inspire deviant metaphors. Some even rebranded it as Holy Leap, which honestly sounds like a very intense 2000s Christian rock band. But what happened to Hugo? He was stripped of his title, confined to a remote monastery, and told to reflect on his misuse of sacred strategy. According to some very suspicious accounts, he continued playing chess in secret, carving pieces out of candle wax and using breadcrumbs to mark their movements. One rumour says he invented a new game entirely, chess crossed with Latin poetry, where you had to compose a verse every time you captured a piece. Which, honestly, sounds unplayable and very on brand for Hugo. Now, the scholarly debate here is why chess was banned so quickly and so harshly. Was it just Hugo's antics, or did chess already have a reputation as dangerous? Some argue it was always quietly distrusted, too abstract, too strategic, too close to the kind of thinking that questions power. Others point out that chess teaches players how to sacrifice the weak to protect the strong, which didn't exactly jive with the whole love thy neighbour thing. There's even a theory that the church feared chess encouraged soul combat, the idea of pitting one's will against divine fate, which, could be seen as a little blasphemous. Regardless, Hugo's little stunt set off a chain reaction. Chess was shunned in monasteries for nearly 80 years. It became a noble's game, divorced from the church, and played mostly in royal courts where metaphors were less spiritually dangerous and more of a party trick. But here's the irony. By banning it, the church actually made it cooler. Forbidden things always are. Soon, owning an ivory-inlaid chessboard became a status symbol. Poets wrote sonnets about queens and knights, entirely unaware that a bishop once almost dismantled the church with 32 carved pieces and too much free time. So next time you're about to crush your cousin in a smug game of chess, just remember, you're participating in a legacy of defiance, a scandal, and strategic blasphemy. And you have Hugo de Vienne to thank for that. Exiled bishop, metaphor enthusiast, and the man who turned a board game into ecclesiastical treason. You're standing in the sun-drenched courtyard of a medieval palace, surrounded by strutting nobles and gossiping courtiers, when you notice something outrageous. A man wearing what can only be described as a bird on his head. No, seriously. There's a full peacock feather fan sprouting from his velvet hat like a one-man parade float. People are trying not to stare, but they're definitely staring. You've just laid eyes on the walking disaster known as Sir Aldrich the Dazzling. And yes, he's the reason feathers in hats got banned. Because of course he is. Now, in medieval Europe, fashion was war. A well-dressed noble wasn't just saying, "Look at me," he was screaming, "I'm wealthier than your entire bloodline." Clothes, fabrics, colours, they all signalled status. But nothing screamed, "I am important," quite like the right hat. And for a brief terrible time, feathers were the crown jewel. Enter Aldrich, a mid-tier knight with high-tier ambition. He didn't have royal blood, but he did have a tailor willing to commit crimes against fashion for the right coin. Aldrich's signature move was the peacock plume, a headdress so large it reportedly knocked over a candle stand at a wedding and set fire to a tapestry. He called it the sky bloom, others called it a hazard to the public. One day Aldrich decides to up the ante. He strolls into the king's council chamber, wearing a hat so tall and feathered it brushes the rafters. His entrance halts conversation. Courtiers duck. One unlucky man sneezes uncontrollably, probably allergic to sheer ego. And that's when it happens. A gust of wind from an open window catches the feathers just right. The plume flaps violently and slaps a visiting duke square in the face mid-sentence, feather to mouth. The duke chokes, stumbles backward, and accuses Aldrich of assault by millinery. What started as an outfit becomes an international incident. That same day, the Queen, who already hated Aldrich for reasons involving a misunderstood serenade beneath her balcony, declares enough is enough. A royal edict goes out. No feathers in hats over 3 fingers tall. Anything more extravagant is deemed offensively flamboyant and a danger to indoor stability. The nobility gasps. Hatters cry softly into their bolts of velvet. The world has changed. Here's the historical fact buried in all this ridiculousness. Sumptuary laws like this feather ban were real. Medieval monarchs routinely regulated what people could wear. Certain colours, like royal purple, or materials, like silk, were restricted to specific classes. These laws weren't just about fashion, they were a way to reinforce social hierarchy. Feathers, especially exotic ones from peacocks, parrots or swans, were imported luxuries. Wearing them screamed, "I have connections and a disturbingly large bird budget." But of course, the quirky part is that after the ban, feathers got even more desirable. People started smuggling them in from Italy like contraband. Secret feather fittings became a thing, nobles having plumes stitched into the interior of their hats for that forbidden fluff. One bold lady-in-waiting even wore a hat lined with hummingbird feathers and claimed it was purely for insulation. A few enterprising courtiers tried to skirt the ban with metal feathers, which looked fancy and didn't technically violate the law, until one broke off during a bow and lodged itself in a duke's shin. That loophole closed fast. Now here's where historians argue. Was the feather ban truly about public safety and dignity? Or was it a political move? Some scholars believe Aldrich's hat incident was just a convenient excuse. The court was teetering on the edge of rebellion, and the nobility's extravagance was stirring unrest among the peasantry. Feathers weren't just silly, they were symbols of inequality, flaunted like medieval neon signs. Banning them may have been a strategic PR move. Others point to an increasing tension between the rising merchant class and the old nobility. Merchants had money, but not titles. By dressing like nobles, yes, with giant feathery hats, they blurred the lines of power. Crackdowns on fashion became a way to put them back in their place. As for Aldrich, well, he didn't take the feather ban well. He tried to protest by arriving at court with a live duck perched on his head, claiming it was natural flair. That went about as well as you'd expect. He was promptly fined, humiliated, and assigned to border patrol, a kind of noble timeout. Reports suggest he kept a small feather hidden in his boot for the rest of his life. For morale. And so ended the reign of flamboyant feather fashion. Nobles turned to jewels, embroidery, and eventually absurdly wide sleeves to show off instead. But the hat was never the same. Thanks to one man's aerodynamic ego, a whole kingdom was forced to tone it down, at least until ruffs and codpieces showed up to make things weird again. So next time you're tempted to wear something just a little over the top, remember Sir Aldrich, fashion icon, air hazard, and the reason your hat doesn't come with its own breeze pattern. You're at the grandest festival of the season, and it's got everything. Fountains of mead, roasted pigs spinning on spits, lute music drifting in the breeze. The jousting arena is packed. Nobles leaning out of balcony boxes with wine-stained lips, servants bustling with trays of roasted chestnuts. You find your seat, squished between a wool merchant and a bishop who smells like boiled onions, just in time to witness a tournament that will end everything. Because today's joust doesn't just end in disaster, it ends in a kingdom-wide ban on tournaments. All because one young prince couldn't stop trying to be impressive. Meet Prince Lionel of Ostrom. Handsome, adored, barely 20, and with enough swagger to fill an entire knight's hall. He was the golden boy of the realm, young, athletic, trained in the knightly arts since before he had proper facial hair, and above all addicted to winning. Lionel's favourite event? The joust. 2 knights, 2 horses, one thunderous collision of egos and wood splinters. He didn't just compete, he dominated. His armour was custom forged, his lance carved from rare blackwood, and his warhorse? Named Judgment, because of course it was. Now, the thing about medieval tournaments is that they were part sport, part courtship ritual, and part blood sport. Sure, people claimed it was about honour and chivalry, but let's be real. It was also about knocking your rival into the mud in front of the nobility, and Lionel was very, very good at it. Too good. By the time this tournament rolled around, Lionel had already unhorsed half the eligible knights of the realm. Some were too bruised to hold a goblet. One minor lord reportedly peed blood for a week. There were whispers that Lionel wasn't just talented, he was dangerous. He wasn't jousting, he was hunting. Still, the crowd adored him. So when he rode into the arena in armour inlaid with silver and banners flying high, people roared. His opponent? A young knight named Sir Roderick of Greystone, new to court, unknown, and probably wishing he'd stayed home. The first pass was brutal. Roderick's lance shattered, Lionel's hit clean across the shield, knocking Roderick sideways. Cheers erupted. Roderick barely stayed in the saddle. The second pass didn't happen. Because Prince Lionel, sensing weakness, broke the code. He charged before the flag dropped, lanced Roderick full in the chest and sent him flying off his horse like a rag doll. The silence in the arena was immediate. Roderick lay still in the dirt, blood trickling through the gaps in his armour. Panic. The Queen stood. The King did not, mostly because he was frozen in shock. Lionel dismounted, swaggering toward the body like he'd just scored a goal, only to realise, too late, that this wasn't one of his usual victories. Roderick was dead. The crowd screamed. The chaos was biblical. Courtiers fainted. The bishop next to you dropped his cup and muttered a curse that's definitely not in the scriptures. Someone's dog ran onto the field and bit Lionel in the ankle, which honestly felt deserved. The tournament was shut down on the spot, but the real fallout came in the days after. Roderick, it turned out, wasn't just a random knight. He was the secret bastard of a powerful noble house. A few whispered threats, a few broken alliances, and suddenly the court was on fire with scandal. The death ignited old feuds. Rumours flew that Lionel had acted on purpose, that he feared Roderick's rising popularity. The word murder floated through the castle halls like incense. So the king, trying desperately to avoid civil war, made a shocking announcement. Tournaments were to be suspended indefinitely, not just cancelled, banned. No more jousts, no more melee games, no more mock battles in flower crowns. The realm had outgrown such bloodthirsty spectacles, he claimed, though most people saw it as damage control. Here's your historical fact. This actually happened more than once in the Middle Ages. After particularly gruesome tournament deaths, especially of nobles or royalty, entire regions would outlaw tournaments for years. The French King Charles V banned them in the late 14th century, and even the Church issued multiple decrees condemning them as distractions from God's work and invitations to sin and pride. But let's be honest, it wasn't about morality, it was about politics. Every knight injured in a tournament was a possible war just waiting to happen. Quirky detail for you, after the ban, frustrated knights didn't just give up. They started holding underground tournaments in barns, forests and abandoned abbeys. Secret duels lit by torchlight. Horses padded to muffle the sound. One group of disaffected squires even started a travelling joust ring complete with code names and fake armour crests, like some medieval version of illegal street racing. Now here's where the debate still rages. Was Lionel's hit really intentional? Some scholars say yes, pointing to letters written by nobles who claimed Lionel had been unbalanced, obsessed with victory, and desperate to prove himself. Others believe it was a tragic accident, a combination of nerves, poor communication, and one extremely bad horse. A few wild theories even claim the lance was sabotaged, that someone set up Lionel to fall by provoking a tragedy that would destabilise the royal family. Conspiracy theories, not just for the internet age. As for Lionel, his fall from grace was swift. No longer the darling of the court, he was sent away to a monastery for reflection, though insiders say it was more like exile. His horse Judgment was given to a noble widow, who reportedly renamed it Mercy, and so, thanks to one fatal charge and a prince with too much pride, a centuries-old tradition came crashing down. The tournaments faded, knights turned to hawking, poetry and grumbling. A few wrote bitter songs about honour lost in velvet halls, which, okay, dramatic, but they weren't wrong. So next time you see two dudes squaring off at a Renaissance fair, remember, somewhere in history, that playful joust got banned forever because one guy just couldn't wait his turn. You're walking through a bustling medieval marketplace. The smell of fresh herbs and unwashed humanity thick in the air when you pass a bakery with the kind of scent that makes you stop in your tracks. Warm, nutty, flowery heaven. Your stomach growls. The sign above the door says, Master Tobin's Fine Breads, and there's a line curling around the corner. Clearly this man is the carb king of the town. You wander inside, coin in hand, eyeing the crusty loaves stacked behind the counter. A girl in front of you whispers to her mother, "They say he uses a secret ingredient." The mother hushes her quickly, eyes darting nervously toward the baker. That doesn't sound ominous at all. And then you take a bite. It's fine. Crunchy and a little dry, but honestly kind of disappointing. You expected something transcendent, but your teeth feel gritty, almost sandy. You discreetly send it into your sleeve and notice something. A tiny wood shaving. What in the sourdough hell? Congratulations, you've just uncovered the bread fraud scandal, the culinary crime that got weird bread banned and turned food regulation into a very serious business. Now, to understand the chaos here, you need to know that in medieval Europe, bread was life. No, literally. For most people, it made up about 80% of their diet. Grains were affordable, sort of, filling, and could be turned into loaves that lasted for days. But here's the twist. The price of grain fluctuated wildly depending on harvests, wars, plagues, and whether someone sneezed on a bishop's sheep that week. So bakers like Master Tobin. They walked a fine line between profit and punishment. Tobin wasn't just a baker. He was an innovator. Or, as later judges would say, a mischievous corrupter of the public loaf. When grain prices soared, instead of shrinking his loaves or raising prices, which would anger his customers, he started padding the bread. With filler. Not terrible stuff at first, things like ground peas, beans, stale crumbs, then bark, then powdered chalk, and eventually actual sawdust. And here's the worst part. He got away with it for nearly a year. People were getting sick, but slowly. Stomach pains, odd rashes, teeth mysteriously cracking in half. Town physicians blamed everything from demonic possession to the moon. No one thought to question the bread. Until one day, the town reeve took a bite of Tobin's harvest loaf and immediately broke a molar. He cracked it open and found what he described as a splinter of the devil's ladder. The loaf was confiscated, examined, and confirmed to contain over 40% non-food matter. Cue the bread riots. People stormed the bakery. Tobin tried to flee out the back with sacks of flour, real finally, slung over his shoulder. He didn't make it far. The guards arrested him, and within days he was standing trial in the town square under charges of adulterating the sacred staff of life. Now here's your historical fact. Medieval towns actually had very strict regulations around bread. In England, there was something called the Assize of Bread and Ale, dating back to 1266. It controlled how bread was priced, weighed and sold. Bakers who cheated the system could be fined, pilloried or even baked, not metaphorically. Some towns had ovens where fraudulent bakers were literally shoved in, clothes and all, for a toasty warning. Tobin avoided baking, barely, but was sentenced to a week in the stocks, with a basket of his own loaves tied around his neck as a sign of shame. People threw everything at him: eggs, rotting apples, ironically good bread. And here's the quirky part. After this scandal, a whole new guild of bread testers was created in several towns. These were actual appointed officials, usually burly men with iron stomachs, who would go bakery to bakery each week, taste testing loaves to ensure they weren't full of tree bark or pebbles. They had official badges and everything. Imagine explaining that job at a medieval party. But here's the debate historians can't settle. Was Tobin the only one doing it, or just the one who got caught? Some argue that dozens of bakers were secretly cutting their flour with whatever they could find: chalk, sand, powdered bone. Tobin just went too far and got unlucky with the Reeve's teeth. Others think he was part of a black market grain ring, intentionally driving up demand for his budget bread while sabotaging rivals. One theory even suggests that nobles looked the other way because Tobin supplied the court kitchens and everyone was in on it. Either way, the fallout was huge. Bakers were suddenly under surveillance. Loaves were required to be stamped with identifying marks. Bakeries had to display their ingredients publicly. Some towns banned multigrain bread entirely, just to keep things simple and less likely to turn into wooden chew toys. And people got suspicious. Bread wasn't trusted for years. Folks started baking at home again, badly, but at least with ingredients they could pronounce. Local flour mills were overrun with demand. A whole generation of children grew up traumatized by the phrase artisan blend. As for Tobin, he was never allowed to bake again. He ended up working in candle making, which honestly still feels too close to food for comfort. So next time you bite into a fresh, crunchy loaf of artisan bread and don't find twigs or shavings inside, take a moment, appreciate that. Because in the Middle Ages, one guy's quest to save a buck almost broke everyone's teeth and trust. You're lounging on the grass during a midsummer fair, watching jugglers toss flaming pins and drunk squires try to race pigs when a hush falls over the crowd. From somewhere behind the cider stall, a voice rises, clear, melodic, and dangerously bold. The lute plays a sultry trill. A hush travels like a ripple across the meadow as the minstrel steps forward, all velvet and smug confidence, his jaw too sharp and his smile way too pleased with itself. Ladies and gentlemen, meet Halric the Honey-Tongued, the man who sang one song too spicy and got public performances banned for years. Now let's be clear. Minstrels were the social media of the Middle Ages. They didn't just entertain, they spread information. News, gossip, royal praise, even thinly veiled insults. They sang it all. And if you had a good rhyme and a sharp enough wit, you could make your name in taverns and castles alike. But there was a line. A very thin, very royal line. Halric did not care about lines. He was famous for his clever verses and dreamy voice. Seriously, people said his falsetto could make milk curdle and heal sick chickens. Women swooned. Men grumbled. Nobles kept trying to recruit him to perform at banquets. But Halric had a rebellious streak. He liked poking the bear. And by bear we mean Queen Elsbeth the Iron-Ribbed, who was famous for two things: her terrifyingly tight corsets and her complete lack of humour. Now here's where it all went sideways. During the summer fair of 1387, Halric performed a new ballad called The Taming of the Wild Mare. On the surface it seemed harmless, a cheeky tale of a noblewoman whose pride was overcome by love. But the lyrics, oh the lyrics, veiled references to unyielding thighs, cold crowns, and a lady's saddle never broken. The Queen's hair was famously red, and guess what colour the mare was? People lost their minds. At first, there was shocked silence. Then a single cackle, probably a cook too drunk to care, and suddenly the crowd exploded with laughter. Elsbeth was watching from her balcony, frozen like a statue carved out of frost. Even her pet hawk looked alarmed. By the time Halric got to the line about a bridal made of tears, the royal guards were already moving. He was dragged off stage mid-strum, loot confiscated, and thrown into the castle's darkest cell, the one reserved for heretics and people who said bad things about the royal hounds. Halric, to his credit, tried to argue that it was satire. The court wasn't amused. Here's your historical fact. Royal censorship of entertainers wasn't just a thing, it was practically a tradition. Minstrels, troubadours, and jesters were often required to register with guilds and submit their lyrics for approval before public performances, especially in cities or courtly settings. In some places, towns employed official listeners, whose job was to record and report any seditious or insulting material. It was like the medieval version of the community guidelines. Halric, of course, ignored all that. After the performance fiasco, Queen Elsbeth issued a decree. All public performances of song or verse must be pre-approved by the royal censor or face immediate closure. Minstrels across the land groaned. Theatres were shut down. Town criers started checking lyrics before events. Spontaneity died a very tragic, very bureaucratic death. But here's the quirky bit. Some performers got creative. With song banned, they turned to puppet shows. Yes, but full-grown adults packed into taverns to watch sock puppets reenact court drama with heavy accents and suspiciously wobbly beards. One troupe called the Wandering Hands even toured 3 counties, doing a finger puppet rendition of the Queen's coronation, which got them chased out of at least 2 towns. The real irony? Halrick's ballad exploded in popularity. Bootleg versions popped up everywhere, scribbled on parchment, whispered in alleys, even painted in rude graffiti on castle walls. The banned song became a rallying cry for every disgruntled bard and lowborn rebel with a rhyming dictionary. Halrick became a legend. And here's where the scholarly debate kicks in. Did Halrick plan it? Was this always meant to be his masterpiece rebellion, knowing full well it would get him arrested and go viral in the most medieval way possible? Some say yes, that he knew exactly what he was doing, baiting the Queen to make a statement about censorship and courtly control. Others think he was just a cocky idiot who rhymed a little too well for his own good. Either way, his punishment was severe. Not execution. Elsbeth was too PR savvy for that. But exile. He was banned from all royal lands, stripped of his status, and forbidden from performing under his own name. For years, minstrels told tales of a hooded man wandering taverns in disguise, trading verses for soup and still whisper singing the wild mare for a price. Meanwhile, public performances stayed heavily regulated for decades. Every song, every every farcical play had to pass through the Office of Performance Decorum. Yes, that was a real thing in some kingdoms. The arts became tamer, safer, and frankly boring. Some nobles claimed it was a return to decency. Most commoners just missed the good stuff. And yet, the banned songs lived on. Whispers in stables, scratched lyrics on in walls. Halrick's defiance preserved like smuggled wine, fermented into legend. His banned tune, though never played again in public during Elsbeth's reign, became part of the underground canon, a ballad with power, proof that sometimes one bold verse could shake a throne. So next time you hear a street performer playing something a little too clever, a little too risky, remember Halrick the honey-tongued, the man who sang too close to the sun and got all the music regulated for a generation. You're inside a cathedral, the kind of place where every whisper sounds like it carries divine weight. Sunlight filters through tall stained glass windows, casting patches of crimson, gold and ocean blue across the cold stone floor. It's beautiful, otherworldly even, and you feel a little unworthy just standing there. Like maybe you should at least pretend to pray or something, but then you step a little closer to one of the windows and you see it. In the corner, beneath a depiction of St. George slaying a dragon, there's a man, bent over, with his trousers down, giving the dragon the kind of salute that would make a sailor blush. It's tiny, hidden in the border design, almost playful, like an inside joke only the Windows artist would understand. Congratulations! You've just found a medieval Easter egg, and this particular one is the reason the entire church cracked down on stained glass artistry for centuries. Let's meet the man responsible, Brother Piers of Eel Hallow, monk, glass-right, and deeply, deeply bored. Now, stained glass as windows weren't just decoration, they were storytelling tools. In a world where most people were illiterate, these luminous panels acted like biblical comic strips. You would get your saints, your martyrs, your angels battling demons, all told in vivid, glowing detail. It was theology in technicolor. Piers had been trained in the sacred art of glass for 20 years, but after a while every Saint Sebastian starts to blur into the next, and somewhere between a depiction of the Last Supper and the martyrdom of St. Lawrence, Piers decided he needed a little creative outlet. Just a little something to keep himself entertained. At first it was subtle. He'd hide a snail jousting a squirrel in the corner of a panel, or give an angel a sly wink and suspiciously toned abs. Then came the rabbits. Too many rabbits. Doing things that rabbits should not be doing. Soon entire border frames were populated with strange scenes. Nuns juggling frogs, monks playing dice with skeletons, saints with mysteriously large noses. One panel even featured a bishop getting his robes caught in a thorn bush bare behind fully on display mid-sermon. People noticed, but for a while nobody said anything. Maybe they thought they were hallucinating. Maybe they just didn't want to accuse a monk of drawing a farting demon in the middle of a crucifixion scene. But the final straw came when Piers unveiled his masterpiece, a giant rose window depicting the resurrection. With a small figure mooning the Archangel Gabriel from the background hillside, the bishop lost it. The next week, a decree came down from on high, all stained glass to be reviewed and approved by ecclesiastical censors before installation. Artistic liberties were now banned. Windows had to be strictly scriptural, pious, and free of frivolous marginalia, which is a fancy way of saying no more butt jokes in holy spaces. And here's your historical fact. The crackdown on visual mischief in sacred art was real. By the late Middle Ages, particularly in the 14th and 15th centuries, church officials across Europe began scrutinising not just the messages in church decor, but the fine print too, especially as art became more detailed and widespread. Marginalia in manuscripts had already been getting weird, and stained glass followed suit. What's quirky is that this wasn't a one-off. Across England, France, and parts of Germany, churches began uncovering similar hidden additions in their windows. Some were humorous, monks chasing ducks with brooms, cats stealing communion wafers, but others were political. In one French cathedral, a window showed a nobleman with a pig's snout. In another, a devil was drawn in the likeness of a local archdeacon. Once people started looking closely, the glass had a lot to say. Naturally, the church panicked. There were formal investigations. Glass artisans were questioned, fined, or reassigned. Some were even excommunicated for mocking the divine. A few tried to argue it was symbolic, but most just admitted they were bored out of their minds and wanted to make each other laugh, which, honestly, understandable. But scholars still debate Piers's intent. Was he just goofing around, or was there something deeper? Some say his moon window was meant as social commentary, an anti-authoritarian dig at an overbearing clergy. Others insist it was just medieval meme culture. You stare at glass for 12 hours a day, you're going to slip in a butt joke eventually. Piers himself disappeared from the record shortly after the scandal. Some say he was quietly reassigned to a distant monastery in Wales. Others claim he went rogue, joining a travelling troupe of heretical artists who hid snarky imagery in wood carvings and frescoes. There's even a theory that he ended up in Prague, working on an infamous chapel rumoured to contain over 80 tiny gargoyles shaped like disgraced bishops. As for the windows, many were altered, censored, or outright destroyed. Replacement glass was rushed in, and new artists were brought under strict supervision. But every now and then, in old churches untouched by time, one or two rogue panels survive. A rabbit holding a beer mug, a monk with crossed eyes, a saint with one oddly arched eyebrow and a knowing look. Tiny acts of rebellion still glowing centuries later. So next time you're in a cathedral and you glance up at the stained glass, don't just admire the saints and halos. Look closer. Look at the margins. You might find Brother Piers still there, hidden in a corner, giving you a wink, and possibly the medieval version of the middle finger. You're walking down the stone corridor of a noblewoman's private chambers. Soft rushes underfoot, tapestries whispering in the draughty silence. The scent of something sweet and powdery lingers in the air, drifting from the crack under the door ahead. You hesitate. Something about it smells too nice, too perfect, almost alchemical. Inside, Lady Marcella of Glenwith sits at her vanity, dabbing a pale cream onto her face. Her skin gleams, flawless porcelain, practically glowing. She turns to you with a gentle smile and says, "It's just egg whites, Rosewar, and a few harmless herbs." And you believe her. Why wouldn't you? Fast forward 6 weeks. Half the court has erupted in angry red welts. One woman is temporarily blind in one eye. A royal hound licks a discarded handkerchief and foams at the mouth. Physicians are called, leeches are consulted, and finally someone tests the cream. Turns out it's not just herbs and rosewater, it's arsenic, lead, and a pinch of something known politely as mercurial enhancement. Translation: poison, poison, and more poison. And just like that, cosmetics are banned at court, because one nobleman wanted better cheekbones. Let's talk about the Great Cosmetic Crackdown, and how Lady Marcella ruined medieval skincare for literally everyone. In the Middle Ages, beauty standards were surprisingly specific. Pale skin meant wealth. You weren't outside toiling in the sun like a peasant. Rosy cheeks, innocence and health, smooth skin, divine favour, Oh, naturally, people started cheating. They didn't have Sephora, but they did have apothecaries, and those guys would sell you anything for this right coin, no matter how questionable. Lady Marcella was known for her beauty. She was also known for her ambition. Dangerous combination. After being passed over by 3 eligible barons, 2 of whom died mysteriously later, but who's counting, she turned her focus inward, literally. Her mirror became her battlefield, and her weapon of choice, a cream she had specially formulated by a disgraced alchemist/surgeon with shaky hands and a criminal record. The cream worked at first. Her skin lightened, her blemishes vanished. People started copying her, and Marcella, never one to resist attention, shared the product with her closest court friends. A touch of moonlight, she called it, a secret from the ancient. What she didn't mention was that the cream contained powdered lead oxide, ground mother of pearl, and yes, arsenic trioxide. Oh, and the rose scent? That was just to mask the mild burning sensation. Soon, entire salons of noblewomen were slathering their faces in slow-acting poison. One woman's skin peeled off in sheets, another developed tremors in both hands and began speaking in riddles, which would have been poetic if it weren't horrifying. A duchess allegedly lost her sense of taste and began compulsively licking windows. Things got real weird, real fast. Here's your historical fact. The use of toxic cosmetics in medieval and Renaissance Europe is well documented. Lead-based white face paint, known as shrews, was common among noble women well into the Elizabethan era. It provided that signature ghostly pallor and, over time, eroded the skin, caused muscle weakness, and led to long-term neurological issues. But beauty was pain, and apparently poison. Now for the quirky bit. After the scandal broke, the king's physicians launched what might be the first recorded cosmetics investigation. They analysed creams, powders, lip stains, even perfumes. Some contained belladonna, which dilated pupils to give women that dreamy, just fainted look. Others included crushed beetles, lizard oil, and the ashes of clean rats. One popular rouge turned out to be red ochre mixed with pig's blood and a dash of wine. Classy. The court, terrified and suddenly covered in blotchy rashes, panicked. Queen Theodette, who had apparently been using Marcella's cream under the codename Evening Balm, issued a sweeping ban. No unregulated cosmetics allowed at court. Apothecaries had to submit their recipes to the Royal Health Office, a room with one guy named Bernard and a lot of ink stains. All beauty products now needed royal approval, and failure to comply meant fines, public naming, or worse, makeup exile. Noble women were outraged. "How dare they take away our creams?" cried one countess, whose eyebrows had fallen out from repeated mercury use. Others simply turned to black market beauty vendors, meeting in secret gardens and candlelit kitchens, passing pots of illegal foundation like contraband. There was even a coded knock for access. 2 taps, a pause, then a third. The beauty underground was alive. Of course, there's still debate about whether Lady Marcella meant to harm anyone. Some scholars think she was simply vain and careless. Others argue she knew exactly what she was doing, that the cream was a long con to take down her social rivals. The timing is suspicious. 3 of her enemies fell gravely ill shortly after receiving generous gifts of the balm. One even left behind a note that read, "Tell Marcella, I see it now," she glows. Marcella herself was never formally charged. She claimed innocence, insisting the cream had healing properties, and that the side effects were from poor diet or the devil's influence. But the king was spooked. He stripped her of her titles, barred her from court, and banished her to a coastal convent where, ironically, the salty sea air did wonders for her complexion. In the wake of the scandal, natural beauty made a comeback. Sort of. Court poets began to praising earthy looks. Sun freckles were called sun kisses. Herbal washes and cold water became all the rage. But of course, behind closed doors, women still experimented. Now with honey, crushed pearl, and the occasional illegal nightshade serum. So next time you open a skincare bottle and see a 37 steps to safety test and dermatologist approval, remember Lady Marcella, the woman who glowed just a little too much, and whose pursuit of perfect skin led to poison, paranoia, and a full-blown beauty ban. You're sitting in the cloistered garden of a medieval monastery, expecting peace, maybe some quiet humming from the herb garden, a few bees buzzing lazily over time. The monks shuffle by in their brown robes, nodding politely. You're trying to mind your own business when suddenly, a loud crash, followed by drunken singing, and what sounds suspiciously like someone belching a hymn. You turn the corner, and there he is, Brother Alfric, arms flung wide, robes stained with something frothy and amber, standing atop a barrel shouting, "Let he who is without sin pour the next round." 3 other monks are passed out in the hedges. One is trying to baptize a cat, and the abbot is weeping softly into a pile of broken tankards. Welcome to the infamous monastic brewery shutdown of 1312, and the monk who partied so hard he got centuries of sacred brewing regulated into oblivion. Now, to set the stage. In medieval Europe, monasteries were basically the OG craft breweries. Monks weren't just about prayer and contemplation, they were master brewers. Beer was cleaner than water, easier to store, and let's be real, much more fun at dinner. Monastic beer was famous across the land. Some monasteries even got rich off it, exporting barrels to nobles and pilgrims alike. Brewing was considered part of the divine order, creating nourishment, practicing labour, and occasionally sipping a bit of heaven. Enter Brother Alfric of Blackmere Abbey. Alfric was brilliant. That's what makes it worse. He could recite entire psalms backward, had memorised half of Hippocrates, and could identify herbs by smell in the dark. But he also had a little too much enthusiasm for fermentation. Where most monks brewed responsibly, modest batches for the community, Alfric had ambition. He expanded the monastery's beer operation until they had more casks than beds. He tinkered with recipes, added exotic spices, started aging brews in old wine barrels for complexity. Soon, Blackmere wasn't just making beer, it was creating a movement. They called it divine elixir. At first, the abbot was pleased. Pilgrims flocked in, donations spiked. Even bishops were requesting private barrels. But then Alfric started throwing tasting nights. Technically, they were supposed to be theological debates. In practice, they were ale-fueled shout-fests ending in group naps and someone accidentally setting the altar cloth on fire with a devotional candle. Things escalated quickly. Alfric developed a new recipe, Heaven's Hammer, a brew so strong it knocked a friar unconscious after 3 sips. A group of monks got lost in their own garden after trying it. One accidentally confessed to being in love with a goose. Another tried to exorcise the stew pot. The final straw came during a high feast when the Bishop of Coventry visited and was served 6 pints of hammer, which led to him publicly challenging a statue of St. Peter to a duel. The very next morning a royal envoy arrived with orders. Monastic brewing is to be regulated immediately. Here's your historical fact. Monastic brewing was a cornerstone of medieval alcohol production. Trappist and Benedictine monks developed some of the earliest beer recipes that are still celebrated today. But there were times when the church, or the state, felt the monks were enjoying their beer a little too much, especially when those barrels started fueling behaviour unbecoming of a religious order. The quirky part? Alfric's Heaven's Hammer didn't disappear. It just went underground. After the ban, several monks smuggled the recipe out during pilgrimage assignments. It popped up in obscure abbeys, hidden in recipe books disguised as fruitcake instructions. In one particularly odd instance, a copy was found in a scroll titled Meditations on Lent, which had absolutely nothing to do with Lent and everything to do with brewing times and optimal yeast temperatures. The official restrictions were harsh. Monasteries could only brew beer for internal use and had to report their batches to the local bishop. No more public tastings, no more exotic ingredients, and absolutely no naming beers after holy figures. One monastery tried to rename their barley wine, saintly sobriety, and was fined for blasphemy. But historians still argue whether Alfric meant any harm. Some say he believed beer brought people closer to God, literally, that it eased suffering, opened hearts, and turned rigid monks into joyful celebrants. Others argue he was a dangerous hedonist who used God as a cover for a lifelong keg stand. The truth? Probably somewhere in the middle. He may have just liked beer a lot and figured, hey, if it makes the chanting easier, who's it hurting? Alfric was removed from his position, not excommunicated, but relocated for reflection. He ended up in a silent order in the Highlands, where, according to legend, he secretly brewed mead in tree stumps and taught sheep how to drink from wooden mugs. The church tried to scrub his name, but monks whispered about him for generations. He became a kind of folk hero, a patron saint of party fowls. Meanwhile, monastic brewing became a shadow of its former glory, carefully measured, monitored, sanitized. The passion was replaced with protocol. Beer still flowed, but the joy not so much. And yet, Alfric's influence never really left. Every time a monk raises a mug a little too enthusiastically, or a cloistered brewery accidentally makes a batch twice as strong as allowed, someone mentions his name with a smirk. So next time you're sipping a craft beer with a fancy name and suspiciously divine flavour, raise a glass to Brother Alfric, the monk who flew too close to the barley sun and got monastic brewing sent straight to confession. You're seated in a torch-lit arena, the scent of blood and sweat and heavily spiced mutton hanging thick in the air. A crowd has gathered, cheering in a nervous, almost gleeful hush. The nobles lean forward in their velvet-lined seats, fanning themselves with silk, while the peasants sit wide-eyed behind the cordon ropes, gripping each other's sleeves in anticipation. At the centre of it all are two people, not knights, not soldiers, just a man and a woman standing in full armour. Not for sport, for trial by combat. Because apparently the best way to resolve a marital dispute in the 1300s was to beat each other with blunt weapons in front of witnesses. You're about to witness the dueling divorce, the case so ridiculous and gruesome it ended trial by combat between spouses forever. Let's rewind. In a time before modern courts, legal decisions sometimes came down to God's judgment. Trial by combat was one such method. Two parties, often nobles, would fight in sanctioned duels to determine guilt or innocence, with the winner presumed to have divine favour. It was brutal, dramatic, and very, very final. But here's the thing. Trial by combat wasn't just for men. In some regions of the Holy Roman Empire, particularly in 13th and 14th century German territories, women could challenge men under very specific conditions. The arena was levelled by handicapping the man. He had to stand in a pit, sometimes waist deep, while the woman fought above with a club. Oh, it was supposed to make things fair. It rarely did. Enter Hans and Margaretha Finsterwald, a couple who began their marriage like most medieval nobles, with a land treaty and mild mutual dislike. Over the years, the dislike bloomed into full-blown hatred, fueled by petty sabotage, accusations of infidelity, and, according to local gossip, a heated argument over who killed the family goose. Eventually, Margaretha filed for legal separation. Rare, but not unheard of. Hands contested, words were exchanged, gloves were thrown, and before you could say irreconcilable differences, both parties demanded a trial by combat. At first, the court laughed, then they realised they weren't joking, and so in front of a stunned village crowd, the duel was arranged. Hans was placed in a deep pit, armed with a club. Margaretha circled above on the arena floor wielding her own weapon, a sack of stones tied to a stick. It looked like a medieval game show gone very, very wrong. The duel began. Margaretha struck first, a solid whack across Hans's helmet. He stumbled but responded by lurching upward from the pit and smashing her shin. They went back and forth like that for several minutes, clumsy rage-fueled swings punctuated by gasps from the crowd and the occasional yell of, "Get him, Margaretha!" Then came the critical moment. Hans, angry and probably humiliated by how well she was doing, tried to climb out of the pit. That was against the rules. As he hauled himself up the side, Margaretha smacked him full force in the face with her stone sack. He tumbled backward, dazed, bloodied. And then, legend says, she took off her shoe and beat him into unconsciousness with it, screaming, "This is for the goose!" Trial over. Divorce granted. Here's your historical fact. While trial by combat is often associated with knights and kings, there were documented cases of commoners, even women, engaging in sanctioned duels in parts of medieval Europe. Germany, especially, had detailed legal codes describing exactly how the pit should be dug, what weapons could be used, and how the combat should proceed. One such code even included instructions for the man to fight with one hand tied behind his back, because fairness is important when you're beating your spouse with a club. But here's the twist. The public reaction to the Finsterwald duel was not admiration. It was horror. The whole thing was supposed to be symbolic, not so personal. The spectacle turned into a scandal. The church condemned it as barbaric. Legal scholars cringed. Other noble families began to worry that if this became a trend, any dinner table spat could end in a duel with Aunt Beatrix swinging a mallet. The quirky bit. For a few years afterward, couples actually threatened duels to speed up divorce settlements. One scribe recorded a petition where a wife offered to meet her husband in the village pig pen with oiled stones and a pious rage. Thankfully, that one was denied. And here's where the scholars argue. Did the Finsterwald fight really end the tradition? Or was it just the most infamous example? Some believe the practice was already on the decline, seen as uncivilized and too dangerous. Others think Margrethe's win was so humiliating to the male-dominated court system that it hastened the push for more controlled, document-based trials. Either way, laws were quietly amended. In many regions, trial by combat was restricted to land disputes only, then eventually banned altogether. Marital duels, gone, replaced with tedious paperwork, dowry negotiations, and the occasional quiet annulment. As for Hans and Margrethe, they never saw each other again. Hans became a hermit in the Black Forest, reportedly warning squirrels never to trust a woman with a sack of rocks. Margrethe returned to her family estate, lived another 30 years, and according to one local legend, taught her granddaughters how to swing with purpose, so next time you're mad at your partner and you think things couldn't possibly be worse, remember this: in the Middle Ages, they might have made you climb into a hole and duel it out in front of your neighbours. And if you were married to Margrethe Finsterwald, you probably wouldn't walk away. You're in the perfumed halls of a medieval palace, trailing behind a cluster of nobles who are all delicately dabbing their necks with handkerchiefs scented like rose, citrus, and possibly vinegar. It's a strange mix, floral, spicy, slightly decaying. But in a world where people bathe maybe twice a month and chamber pots are emptied out of windows, anything that smells better than city is worth its weight in gold. Perfume in the Middle Ages wasn't just a luxury, it was survival. For nobles, it masked more than body odour. It cloaked you in status. A whiff of sandalwood and musk, power. A dab of jasmine oil, royal intrigue. And no one wielded perfume more powerfully or more fatally than Isolde of Alnwick, the courtesan who turned fragrance into a weapon and got the entire court's perfume collection tossed into the moat. Let's set the stone. Isolde wasn't born noble, but she played the game better than anyone. Sharp, mysterious, with a voice like poured wine and a laugh that could melt wax, she entered court life as a favoured companion to a high-ranking duke. Within a year, she was the talk of every banquet. Within 2, she had rival noblewomen clutching their pearls. Her secret: scent. She wore custom perfumes, small vials kept in silver pendants, tiny pots tucked into her sleeves, even powdered oils rubbed behind her knees. Every room she entered was marked by a signature smell: a little bergamot, a hint of clove, a final note of something no one could quite identify. People whispered that she had a secret perfumer, that her body naturally gave off honeyed spice. One court poet wrote, "She smells like confession and sin." And then people started dying. It began subtly. A count fainted mid-conversation with her and never woke up. A young knight kissed her gloved hand and developed a violent rash across his face. A lady-in-waiting borrowed her comb and fell ill that same night. At first, these were dismissed as coincidences. Court life was dangerous. Plague still lingered. So did bad fish. But the rumours spread. Isolde's perfume was cursed. Or worse, poisoned. And it wasn't just the victims. Servants who cleaned her chambers complained of headaches. A perfumer's apprentice claimed to have lost his sense of smell after testing one of her samples. The turning point came when a visiting foreign ambassador, eager to impress her, requested a private audience. He was found dead in his quarters the next morning, eyes wide, skin tinged with a faint lavender hue. At that point, even the king had questions. Isolde was summoned to explain herself. She arrived in a cloud of the infamous scent, dressed in silk the colour of stormy sky, and calmly offered her vials for inspection. The royal physicians, 3 aging men with long beards and longer egos, studied the mixtures. Their findings? Inconclusive. The perfume did contain rare ingredients: orris root, ambergris, saffron, and a suspicious trace of arsenic trioxide. Again with the arsenic, Isolde didn't deny it. "It preserves the fragrant," she said sweetly, "and reminds the nose of mortality." Poetic, yes, but also alarming. The court exploded. Nobles began tossing their perfume flasks into the fire. The Queen issued an emergency decree. All perfumes and scented oils banned from court until further notice. Any found carrying scented materials would be searched, fined, or removed from royal premises. The ban extended to merchants, bathhouses, and even churches, where censers filled with sweet incense were suddenly extinguished mid-mass. Here's your historical fact. Medieval perfumery wasn't just about scent. It was tied to medicine, alchemy, and sometimes outright sorcery. Certain fragrances were believed to ward off disease, spirits, or temptation. But others? Others were feared. Poisoning via perfume or scented gloves was a legitimate concern, especially during the Renaissance. There are records of deaths attributed to toxic beauty products and kiss-of-death perfumes, often laced with real poisons like belladonna, mercury, or arsenic. Isolde, naturally, became the centre of a scholarly debate. Some believed she was a serial poisoner, strategically eliminating enemies under the guise of seduction. Others argued she was framed, perhaps by jealous rivals, or the Duke himself, who had mysteriously fallen ill not long after a public argument with her. One fringe theory even claims Isolde wasn't real at all, but an amalgamation of several notorious women whose stories blurred together over time like too much wine at a feast. The quirky part? After the perfume ban, nobles didn't give up entirely, they just got sneakier. Cloaks were lined with scented herbs, pouches of dried lavender were sewn into hemlines. One enterprising baroness had a hollowed-out pendant filled with crushed mint leaves that she would sniff dramatically during tense conversations. Perfume smuggling became a real thing, with underground sellers peddling sandalwood oil like it was opium. As for Isolde, she vanished. Some say she fled to Venice, where she opened a luxury bathhouse and lived under an assumed name. Others believe she died quietly, her own poisons finally catching up to her. One truly romantic version claims she retired to a convent, living out her days in Medundes. Except for the faint trace of cinnamon and myrrh that followed her down the stone halls. The perfume ban lasted a full decade. Even after it was lifted, people were never quite the same. Scent became suspicious. A whiff of lilac could silence a room. Lovers sniffed each other cautiously. Gifted handkerchiefs were boiled before use. The trust between nose and nobility had been broken. So next time you spritz something behind your ears before heading out, remember Isolde, the woman who turned fragrance into fear, romance into danger, and made smelling good officially illegal. You're attending a feast in a candle-lit hall, where everything's just a bit too extravagant. The kind of place where the napkins are embroidered, the goblets are gold, and the musicians play so delicately, it feels like your food might get offended if you chew too loudly. Nobles are laughing, a jester is juggling figs for some reason, and everyone's eyes are slowly turning toward the far end of the table. That's where Sir Torwin of Hollandale is making his entrance. And what he's wearing? Oh, it's a problem. He's strutting down the hall like a medieval fashion icon, clad in a pair of screamingly bright, absurdly tight and offensively yellow trousers. We're talking sunshine dipped in egg yolk, rolled in saffron, and slapped onto someone with zero self-awareness. The moment he sits down after a heroic struggle with the chair and his dignity, you can practically hear the silent groan ripple through the noble ranks. That night will become legend, and by the end of it, the colour yellow will be banned at court, because of one pair of pants. Let's rewind a bit. In medieval Europe, colour meant everything. You didn't just throw on whatever tunic didn't smell like goat that morning. No, your clothing's colour was a code. Blue suggested piety, red was power, purple was reserved for royalty, or people deeply committed to going broke. Yellow. Well, yellow was tricky. Depending on where you were, yellow could symbolise wealth, warmth, light, and also cowardice, betrayal, and awkwardly things associated with illness and waste. It was the medieval equivalent of a mood ring, only no one could agree on what mood it meant. Enter Sir Torwin. Torwin wasn't important exactly, but he wanted to be. A minor noble with a decent estate and a desperate hunger for attention, he'd recently returned from a visit to southern France, where brightly coloured fashion was en vogue. He saw someone wearing lemon-coloured hose and thought, yes, that, but louder. So he commissions a pair of pants that push the limits of dye science. Crafted from imported silk, dyed using a rare and deeply unstable blend of saffron, marigold, and possibly crushed wasp nest, nobody's quite sure. Torwin's trousers glowed like someone had trapped sunlight and attached it to a very bad decision. His debut? The King's Autumn Banquet. At first, people tried to ignore him. Maybe it was a trick of the torchlight. Maybe he spilled something. But the moment he stood to give a toast, it was over. His trousers caught the firelight and practically radiated. A duchess gasped. A child cried. A falcon perched in the rafters dropped a feather in alarm. And then Torwin made it worse. He raised his goblet and shouted, "To boldness!" then slipped on a puddle of gravy and fell backward off the dais, legs kicking, pants screaming, pride broken. The laughter was instant and brutal, but the fallout wasn't just embarrassment. That particular shade of yellow, it clung to the court's memory. The next week, poets were writing satirical ballads called The Breaches of Blinding Woe. A tapestry appeared in a merchant's stall depicting the fall of Sir Torwin, complete with embroidered butt cheeks. People started calling anyone who wore yellow a Torwin. It was colour-based bullying on a national level. And so, in an effort to restore dignity and prevent further visual trauma, the Crown issued a decree. Yellow clothing in all its shades and vibrancies was henceforth banned at official functions, especially trousers, especially silk ones. Torwin indirectly had destroyed an entire hue. Here's your historical fact. Sumptuary laws in medieval Europe were very real and extremely petty. They controlled not just what people wore, but what colours they could use, how much embroidery was allowed, how long your sleeves could be, yes, sleeve length was a crime, and even what materials were appropriate for each social class. Colour bans weren't unheard of. Green, for example, was restricted in some places due to its connection to illicit love, and yellow, often associated with outcasts, heretics and traitors. The quirky twist here. After the yellow ban, courtiers got very creative trying to sneak it back in. One lady had her dress hem-stitched with gold thread that reflected yellow in certain light. A count commissioned a painting of himself in golden armour that conveniently looked like butter. Even the Queen was caught wearing sun-touched cream, which was just a fancier way of saying this is yellow and you can't stop me, but scholars still debate Torwin's intentions. Was he trying to make a statement? Did he know yellow's murky associations and wear it as a rebellious jab at court tradition? Or was he just a clueless fashion victim with more money than taste? Some believe he was mocking the elite by wearing something outrageous to highlight their vanity. Others think he was simply blinded by trend chasing and the promise of silk so bright it could signal ships at sea. As for Torwin, he fled court shortly after the decree, disappearing into the comfortable obscurity. Some say he moved to Florence and became a silk trader. Others claim he opened a tailoring shop where every item was dyed grey out of sheer trauma. One particularly spicy legend says he joined a travelling theatre troupe and wore yellow every night on stage as an act of defiance. Meanwhile, yellow never quite recovered. For years it was associated with folly, with shame, with Torwin. Painters avoided it in portraits, courtiers shunned it. Children were told that wearing yellow would bring bad luck, or worse, unwanted attention. So next time you throw on a bright, bold outfit and think, this might be too much, remember Sir Torwin, the man whose pants were too loud for medieval Europe and who proved, once and for all, that fashion can, in fact, be a crime. You're out in the crisp morning air, watching a nobleman stand in the middle of a field wearing an expression of deep pride and a leather glove on one hand. On that glove, a massive falcon, majestic, sharp-eyed and judging everything around it like it's the only one in the room with a working brain. There's something undeniably impressive about falconry. It's elegant, symbolic, and somehow manages to scream both noble tradition and don't even think about touching my bird. That nobleman, that's Sir Guy de Molbrook, and unfortunately he's also about to be the reason civilian falconry was banned for an entire region. Because, of course, he couldn't just play by the rules. He had to go and weaponize the sport. Literally. Falconry was a big deal in the Middle Ages, especially among the upper classes. It wasn't just hunting, it was pageantry, power and performance rolled into one. Birds were matched to social rank. Only the king could fly a gerfalcon. Barons got peregrines. Ladies carried merlins, small, fierce and adorable like the bird equivalent of a noble's lapdog with murder in its heart. The birds were trained, pampered, and sometimes cost more than entire estates. It wasn't uncommon for nobles to sleep with their favourite falcons perched beside the bed, as if waking up next to something with talons was romantic. Guy de Molbrook, third son of an irrelevant earl, was desperate for recognition. He was fine at tournaments when he didn't get distracted, awful at poetry, and once accidentally insulted a duchess by comparing her laugh to a donkey's sneeze. Falconry was his last chance to stand out, so naturally he borrowed a prized royal hawk named Aldetha. Let's be clear, this bird was not meant for amateurs. Aldetha was trained for high-level hunting, capable of taking down herons, hares, and possibly horses if sufficiently annoyed. She had battle scars, custom-made jesses, and a gaze like sharpened steel. She also happened to be the Queen's personal hunting bird. Guy, in a stunning display of both ego and stupidity, decided to use Aldetha to impress a group of foreign dignitaries during a private hunt. He hadn't cleared it with the falconer, or the queen, or anyone. He just strapped on the glove, whistled confidently, and let her fly. At first, things went great. Aldetha soared through the sky in perfect formation, circling with majestic precision. The guests applauded. Guy smirked. He whispered something smug about commanding the winds, and then Aldetha spotted her target. A blur of white and gold trotting through the distant grass. It was Prince Corwin's prized Italian greyhound, a delicate little creature named Belisandra, a pampered royal pet with a pearl collar and a taste for goat cheese. Aldetha swooped before anyone could blink, talons out, and within seconds, Belisandra was airborne, screaming, flailing, and very much not the target bird she'd been trained to pursue. Chaos erupted. Guy screamed. The prince screamed louder. One of the guests fainted into a bush. Aldetha, misunderstanding the panic as encouragement, proceeded to fly in triumphant circles above the hunting party, dragging Belisandra like some kind of horrifying canine banner. The queen's falconers were dispatched immediately. Aldetha was eventually coaxed into landing with a bribe of raw venison, and Belisandra, miraculously still alive, was freed. Shaken, scratched, and forever traumatized. But the damage? Already done. Here's your historical fact. Falconry was highly regulated in the medieval world. Birds were symbols of status and not to be mishandled. There were entire guilds dedicated to training, breeding, and caring for them. Unauthorized use of a noble or royal bird could result in steep fines, or worse, jail time. In some regions, peasants were banned from even owning birds of prey. The rules were taken very seriously. The moment word of Belisandra's aerial adventure reached the palace, an edict came down. Civilians were banned from practicing falconry, unless under direct supervision of an authorized falconer. No more casual hunts, no more amateur bird tamers. Every hawk, falcon, and even the occasional owl had to be registered, documented, and in some cases, literally chained up. The free-flying era of falconry was clipped overnight. Now for the quirky bit. The bird herself became a legend. Aldetha was given a royal pardon. Yes, they actually wrote it out in florid script. Upgraded to first falcon of the realms and retired with honours. She spent the rest of her days perched on a velvet cushion beside the queen's throne, occasionally snatching meat from courtiers' fingers if they bowed too close. A tapestry depicting her glorious flight was commissioned, notably omitting the greyhound part. And what of Sir Guy? Banished. Not dramatically, just escorted off the property with a strongly worded letter and a lifetime ban on touching anything with feathers. He reportedly tried to redeem himself by starting a ground falconry movement using trained ferrets. It did not catch on. He later moved to Bruges and sold decorative gloves. Historians still bicker over whether Aldetha mistook the dog for prey, or if, as some suggest, she was trained to go off-script by a rival court faction hoping to humiliate Guy. There's a particularly wild theory that Belisandra had once nipped Aldetha during a palace garden incident, and the attack was a premeditated act of falcon revenge. Birds remember. Either way, the ban stuck. Falconry shifted from a social event to a guarded privilege. Nobles lamented the loss of their fashionable pastime. Birds were locked away. Peasants, who never had birds to begin with, just kept wondering what was wrong with sticks and snares. So next time you see a bird of prey doing a majestic dive, remember that once upon a time, a single falcon, a clueless noble, and a very unlucky greyhound turned one of Europe's most prestigious sports into a royal scandal. You're inside the private quarters of a bishop's residence, a surprisingly lavish chamber, filled with velvet cushions, imported tapestries, and a disturbing number of half-empty goblets. At the centre of it all sits Bishop Rinaldus of Grinmere, red-faced, laughing so hard he's nearly choking on a meat pie. Surrounding him, a pile of dice, a handful of silver coins, and 4 monks with the kind of expressions that say, "We are definitely going to hell, but we're hoping to win big first." This scene is the beginning of the dice scandal of Grinmere, a gambling fiasco so notorious it got dice games banned in multiple parishes, and permanently stained the church's attempt to look like it wasn't secretly running a medieval casino. Let's set the stage. Dice games had always existed on the fringes of medieval society, played in taverns, alleys, and the backs of blacksmith shops after hours. It was considered lowbrow entertainment associated with vice, drunkenness, and unpaid debts. But here's the twist. Clergy weren't immune to a little roll of the bones. Some monks dabbled casually, a few developed dangerous habits, and then came Ronaldus, who turned dabbling into a full-blown dice empire. Bishop Ronaldus wasn't what you'd call a humble servant of the Lord. He was ambitious, flamboyant, and deeply addicted to what he called the mathematics of divine chance. He'd been introduced to dice by a visiting Italian scholar who claimed it improved memory and moral reasoning. Within weeks, Ronaldus was hooked. He started organising private games in the bishop's library, complete with cheese platters, honeyed wine, and entry fees. At first it was quiet, then the stakes grew. He wagered relics, land contracts, even a pair of ceremonial vestments. One night, in a haze of mead and hubris, he bet the cathedral's bell and lost it to a friar who immediately turned around and traded it to a metalworker for 3 pigs and a singing goat. The local faithful began to notice. Services were late. Donations mysteriously disappeared. The bishop's sermons included bizarre references to rolling doubles for redemption and casting your sins like snake eyes upon the altar. One Sunday he compared the resurrection to a winning throw and concluded his homily with a flourish of actual dice, which he then tossed into the offertory box. Subtle he was not. But what truly detonated the scandal was the Holy House game, a secret invitation-only dice tournament hosted by Ronaldus inside the cathedral cloisters. Entry required a minimum bet of 1 relic or sacred object. Dozens of clergy came, some travelling miles in disguise. They brought scent bones, jewelled crosses, gilded Bibles, anything they could gamble. A nun brought her abbess's ring. A canon bet his donkey, who waited patiently outside in the rain. The winner of the final game? A young unnamed deacon who walked away with a chalice, a land deed, and what he thought was the finger of St. Jerome. It was later identified as pork bone. Unfortunately for all involved, word got out. A travelling monk who'd been denied entry reported the event to the archbishop. A papal legate was dispatched. The investigation was swift, brutal, and fueled by absolute fury. The church had been trying to root out gambling for years, especially among clergy, and now here was a bishop practically turning the house of God into a dice parlour. Here's your historical fact. The medieval church frequently condemned games of chance. Dice and gambling were associated with sin, sloth, and corruption. Several councils, including the Council of Elvira as early as the 4th century, explicitly banned clergy from participating in such games, but enforcement was inconsistent and underground play persisted, especially in wealthier dioceses where bishops had more coin and fewer eyes on them. After the Grinmere scandal, things changed. The church issued an expanded ban. All games of chance, particularly dice and card games, were forbidden within any religious institution or by any person under holy orders. Monasteries were searched, dice confiscated. Gambling tables were burned in dramatic public bonfires. In one overzealous case, a monk was forced to confess while tied to a stake made from a former dice board. But here's the quirky bit. Dice didn't disappear. They just went incognito. Crafty players disguised dice as rosary beads. Gambling songs became coded hymns. In some monasteries, monks invented mathematical meditation exercises, which, when decoded, turned out to be complex betting system. A set of devotional cubes was found in Prague that rolled with prayers on each side, but if you added up the right verses, it spelled out who owed what. Back to Ronaldus. He was defrocked, exiled, and reportedly ended up running a travelling miracle show under the name Father Fortune. One report claims he staged a comeback by selling holy dice blessed to bring spiritual prosperity, which is just marketing spin for rigged but shiny. He eventually vanished from the records, though a suspiciously well-fed monk in Burgundy with an excellent wine collection may or may not have been him. Today, historians argue whether the scandal was exaggerated. Some suggest the church used Ronaldus as a scapegoat to scare clergy into line. Others believe he really did gamble away everything but the altar. What's not up for debate is the impact. Dice games in churches, monasteries, or anywhere near holy ground became taboo. Even centuries later, small rural churches refused to allow board games at fundraising fairs, terrified that someone might get too into backgammon and summon the spirit of Bishop Ronaldus. So next time you sit down to play a friendly game of dice, remember, in the Middle Ages, rolling for fun could get you defrocked, excommunicated and chased out of town with nothing but a fake relic and a very embarrassed goat. You're standing at the edge of a village square, blinking in disbelief as people whirl past you like spinning tops possessed by joy, demons, or both. It's not a festival, there's no music, just a rising cacophony of foot-stomping, heavy breathing, and the increasingly alarming sound of dozens of shoes slapping the cobblestone like someone forgot how to stop moving. This is not a party. This is the dancing plague of Vensbrook, and you're watching the exact moment when spontaneous boogieing became so terrifying that it got banned across multiple towns, all because of one very charismatic farmer named Otmar. Now, medieval Europe had its fair share of odd behaviour. Visions, mass fainting, religious ecstasies. But this was something else entirely. Let's back up. Otmar of Vensbrook was, by most accounts, a perfectly average man. He grew cabbage, prayed sometimes, owned a surprisingly large number of wooden spoons. But what made Otmar special, dangerous even, was his enthusiasm. He was the kind of guy who clapped at sunsets, danced when it rained, and invented little songs for his chickens. People liked him in a he's fun at festivals but don't let him near the mead sort of way. Then came the summer of 1518, a hot, sticky season when tempers ran high, food ran low, and tensions danced just under the surface. Otmar, he danced on top of them. One morning he entered the square barefoot, humming to himself. Then, without warning, he started dancing. Not a little jig, a full-body performance. Arms waving, feet stomping, hips doing something no medieval pelvis should be doing in public. Villagers gathered. At first they laughed. Oh, Otmar being Otmar. Then 5 people joined in, then 20. By sundown, nearly 40 people were dancing, and no one could stop. They danced through the night. Into the next day. People collapsed. Some wept. Others kept going, eyes glazed, mouths dry. Otmar led them all, flailing like he'd discovered some cosmic beat only he could hear. After 3 days, a local priest begged the town to ring the church bells in an attempt to scare the devil out of them. It didn't work. One dancer clapped in time with the tolls. This went on for 9 days. By the time outside officials were summoned, the square had turned into a surreal nightmare of twitching limbs, cracked heels, and tunics soaked through with sweat. 3 people had died, 2 from exhaustion, 1 from literally dancing into a well. The village healer tried throwing buckets of cold water on everyone, but ended up slipping and dislocating his jaw. It wasn't funny. Okay, it was a little funny. Otmar was finally restrained by 4 exhausted blacksmiths and tied to a plough. Even then, he kept tapping his foot. So what caused it? Here's your historical fact. Mass dance manias did occur in medieval Europe. The most famous was the 1518 dancing plague in Strasbourg, where dozens of people danced uncontrollably for days, some until death. Historians still debate the cause: psychological stress, ergot poisoning, a fungus that can cause hallucinations, religious fervour, or some combination of all 3. In Otmar's case, no official cause was ever found. Some said he was cursed, others believed he was a prophet. One theory claimed he simply hated silence and wanted to create a movement of the soul. The aftermath was swift and dramatic. Town leaders passed a decree: no dancing in public spaces unless sanctioned by church or festival officials. Music was banned in the square for 6 months. Drums were confiscated. Even rhythmically sweeping the street was frowned upon. Otmar, now a pariah, was sent to a nearby monastery for contemplation. The monks quickly regretted it after he taught their pigs to march in time. But the real quirky twist? Other towns copied the ban. Vensbrook's reputation for spontaneous choreography spread, and terrified magistrates across the region implemented their own anti-dancing laws. In one village, you could be fined for whistling and tapping your foot at the same time. A travelling lute player was once arrested for provocative harmonics. Dancing became an act of rebellion, and yet people couldn't help themselves. Secret dance circles emerged in the woods. Underground troubadours performed for masked crowds who twirled in silence, terrified of drawing attention. One report from 1520 tells of a wedding where the guests danced only from the knees down so as to remain wholly above the waist. Fashion even shifted. Shoes were made softer, quieter, so you could groove without attracting notice. As for Otmar, according to the monastery's records, he escaped after 4 months, disappeared into the Blackwald, and was never seen again, at least not officially. But rumours persisted of a hooded figure, who would appear in isolated villages and leave chaos in his wake. People claimed he inspired a 6-hour jig in a northern fishing town, a barefoot reel during Lent, and even a goat-led conga line at a midsummer festival. To this day of Aarhus, some call him the Saint of Steps, the Prophet of Rhythm, or simply the man who danced too close to God. So next time your favourite song comes on and you start moving, even just a little, remember that in the Middle Ages dancing wasn't just risky. It could start a movement that no one could stop, and sometimes all it takes is one overly enthusiastic cabbage farmer to turn an entire village into a cautionary tale. You're seated in a dusty wooden courtroom that smells like damp parchment and self-righteous indignation. At the centre of the room, 2 noble families sit on opposite benches, their faces pinched in silent fury. You're expecting a land dispute, maybe an argument over dowry goats or stolen turnips, but then the bailiff calls the defendant. A goat. Yes, an actual goat is led into the courtroom, wearing a little chain around its neck and a slightly confused expression. It bleats once, innocently. No one laughs. Because this isn't a joke. This is the trial of Lord Percival's goat, a court case so utterly ridiculous, so absolutely sincere in its execution, that it ended with a kingdom-wide revision of legal rights for animals, and the official end of livestock testimony in civil disputes. Let's back up. Lord Percival of Tatterdown was known for 2 things: his obsession with justice and his beloved goat, Elsinore. A prized alpine doe, she was unusually clever, fiercely loyal, and, according to Percival, possessed of a noble temperament and superior reasoning. He wrote poems about her, she had a cushion in his solar, rumour had it she once picked the winning hand in a game of cards, which raises a lot of questions. Now, his neighbours, the Lutchfields, despised Percival. Long-standing land disputes, insulted lineage, and one unfortunate fencing accident involving a trellis and a barrel of pickled onions had poisoned relations for years. When Elsinore wandered across the boundary line and allegedly trampled a prize rose garden, the Lutchfields saw their chance. They sued, for damages for trespass, and, this is key, for intentional malice. That last bit was the problem, because claiming a goat acted with intent to destroy meant the court had to evaluate intent, and you can't evaluate intent without hearing from the accused, which is how Elsinore the goat became the first non-human in Tatterdown to stand trial. The court somehow agreed. A cleric was assigned as Elsinore's defence advocate. Witnesses were called. One stable boy claimed she had a glint in her eye and always looked like she was plotting. A gardener swore she once headbutted him after he insulted her hooves. The Lutchfields produced sketches, yes, sketches, of the destroyed roses, and claimed the hoofprints formed a pattern that resembled mockery. The defence was no less absurd. Lord Percival argued that Elsinore was being scapegoated, pun absolutely intended, and insisted she was incapable of ill will. He cited past examples of her kindness, giving milk to an orphaned lamb, kneeling politely during Sunday prayers, though this was later attributed to a sprained ankle, and, bizarrely, her expressive emotional range. The court proceedings lasted 3 days. There were heated debates, testimonies, and even a musical interlude, courtesy of Percival, who composed a ballad entitled The Goat Who Knew Not Hate, and then came the verdict. The court found Elsinore guilty. She was sentenced to symbolic banishment, exiled from the Lutchfield estate, which she had never wanted to visit in the first place. Lord Percival, enraged and humiliated, stormed out of the courtroom, vowing vengeance. Elsinore? She peed on the courtroom floor and was escorted out with more dignity than most nobles. Here's your historical fact. Believe it or not, animal trials were a real part of European legal history, especially between the 13th and 18th centuries. Pigs, cows, goats, and even insects were sometimes put on trial for crimes ranging from crop destruction to assault. Some were hanged, others excommunicated. The Church treated these cases with bizarre seriousness, using them to reinforce moral order even if it meant putting a rooster on trial for laying a demonic egg. But the quirky twist here is how this trial pushed things too far. Elsinore's case became a laughingstock across the region. Poets mocked it, pamphlets were published. One travelling bard wrote a song called Justice Bleats, which was banned for causing unrest at inns. Farmers began joking that their sheep needed lawyers, and children started playing a game called Goat Court, where one kid pretended to chew roses and the others held mock trials in barns. The nobles were furious, the courts were embarrassed, and so a decree was quietly issued. Animals could no longer be tried as legal persons in civil disputes. From now on, if your neighbour's cow crushed your cabbages, you sued the neighbour, not the bovine. As for Lord Percival, he didn't take the ruling well. He withdrew from public life and focused entirely on writing a book titled Elsinore, A Soul Misunderstood. It sold poorly. He was last seen living alone with a growing number of goats, all of whom were reportedly named after judges who ruled against him. Elsinore lived another 6 years and died peacefully, surrounded by admirers, mostly other goats. She was buried with honours, and her headstone reads, "Convicted but never convinced." To this day, her trial is cited by scholars as the moment when medieval law finally admitted that trying to read a goat's mind in a courtroom might not be the best use of anyone's time. So next time you see a pet acting out and think, they know exactly what they're doing, remember Elsinore. She might have trampled some roses, but she also trampled the illusion that the legal system had even the faintest grasp on reality. You're soaking in a steaming bathhouse, the kind of place where your only job is to stop thinking and let the rosemary-scented fog do all the work. Candles flicker softly on stone ledges, voices murmur over splashes of water, and somewhere nearby someone's playing a reed flute slightly off-key. It's warm, cosy, oddly social for a bath, and for a brief moment you feel like maybe the Middle Ages weren't entirely about plagues, mud, and constant warfare. Then the screaming starts. You bolt upright. The flute stops mid-squeak. A man bursts into the central pool chamber, wearing only a towel and a dagger in his chest. He collapses face first into the water, and suddenly the bathhouse is chaos. Robes flying, water sloshing, someone yelling about demons. This, unfortunately, is the infamous bathhouse betrayal of Ehrenfeld, the assassination that got public bathhouses banned for decades and turned self-care into a security threat. Let's rewind. In the 12th and 13th centuries, bathhouses were the place to be. Medieval hygiene gets a bad rap, but many cities had public bathhouses, often run by monasteries or guilds, where you could soak, scrub and socialise. Some were gendered, others co-ed, scandalous. They offered food, music, massages, basically the medieval equivalent of a spa day meets coffee shop with optional political scheming in the hot tub. Nobles, merchants, monks, they all went, which is why it made the perfect crime scene. Lord Bram of Ehrenfeld was not a popular man, wealthy, loud, politically obnoxious, and blessed with the emotional sensitivity of a kick beehive. He'd made enemies on every side of the power structure, taxed the peasants, mocked the clergy, tried to turn a soup kitchen into a falconry school, but he also had impeccable taste in bathing. Every Thursday afternoon without fail, he reserved the central pool of the city's largest bathhouse, bringing wine, musicians, and an unfortunate number of scented oils that smelled like wet cinnamon. Everyone knew his schedule, including his assassin. Details remain fuzzy, but here's what the court record says. Bram was soaking, monologuing loudly about the weakness of his rivals, when a servant entered with fresh towels. Except it wasn't a servant. It was a disguised mercenary, hired, allegedly, by a coalition of Bram's political enemies and one extremely annoyed baker whose roof Bram had stolen. The assassin struck fast, slipping a small curved blade between Bram's ribs before vanishing into the steam. Now here's the twist. Bram didn't die immediately. He staggered into the main room, soaking wet, bleeding, shouting accusations no one could understand because he was also gargling bathwater. By the time anyone figured out what had happened, the killer was long gone, leaving behind only a towel monogrammed SH and a trail of footprints that ended in the kitchen. The entire city lost its mind. The bathhouse was shut down within the hour. Witnesses were interrogated. Patrons were searched, robes confiscated, one monk arrested for suspiciously soft hands. Word spread like wildfire. Some claimed the assassin had been a woman in disguise. Others said the murderer was Bram's own cousin, long thought lost at sea. A few suggested he'd been cursed by a soap witch. None of these stories were helpful, but they were wildly entertaining. Here's your historical fact. While not common, political assassinations in bathhouses did happen in medieval Europe. Bathing, being one of the few times people disrobed and let down their guard, created a uniquely vulnerable environment. No armour, no weapons, no witnesses once the steam rolled in. Cities like Paris, Prague and Constantinople all recorded incidents of sudden accidents during bathing rituals, and in several cases, bathhouse attendants were later found to be hired killers or spies. After Bram's watery demise, the panic wasn't just about murder, it was about intimacy. people suddenly realised how exposed they were in the steam, surrounded by strangers, vulnerable and relaxed. It shattered trust. Within a week, the City Council of Ehrensfeld passed a law. All public bathhouses were to be shut down until further notice. Other cities followed. In some places, the church seized the opportunity to denounce bathhouses as dens of vanity and sin. Priests began preaching about the naked temptations of warm water. One bishop even claimed that Satan was most likely to whisper blasphemy when your pores were open. Of course, the ban didn't kill bathing altogether, it just made it secret. Private bathing chambers became a status symbol. Wealthy nobles installed tubs in their homes, often requiring servants to guard the doors while they soaked. Peasants, left without public baths, returned to rivers and barrels. Soap makers suffered, aromatherapists wept. And the quirky bit? The black market for bathhouse experiences exploded. Underground bathhouses, literally in basements, popped up across cities. They operated like speakeasies, candle-lit, invitation only, often protected by bribes to local guards. Some even used coded door knocks, like tap tap splash followed by squelch. Real thing. Totally disgusting. As for the assassin, never caught. But the legend endured. Playwrights turned the incident into a tragedy titled Steam and Treachery. Children played a game called Hot Water, where one kid pretended to be Bram and the others tried to stab him with a stick of soap. Eventually, the story of Lord Bram's death morphed into a cautionary tale about trusting strangers, overusing cinnamon, and being too smug in a bathhouse. Scholars still argue whether the murder was a well-orchestrated conspiracy, or just an opportunistic vendetta. A few even suggest Bram faked his death and disappeared, too embarrassed by the situation to show his face again. There is a tavern in the Eastlands, with a faded painting of a wet nobleman and the caption, "No one drowns quietly." So next time you settle into a hot bath and sigh in bliss, just remember, once upon a time a nobleman with too many enemies and too few towels turned bathing into a political hazard, and for a while it became illegal to get clean without wondering who might be hiding behind the steam. You're curled up in the back of a scriptorium, a narrow little room that smells like candle wax, damp wood and ink that's been boiled one too many times. All around you, monks in threadbare robes are bent over long desks and silently scratching quills against parchment. Every few minutes, someone sighs dramatically or sneezes ink onto a perfectly clean page. This is where books are born, by hand, one painstaking letter at a time. The pace is glacial, the silence is sacred. The margins? Well, the margins are where things get weird. You're watching Brother Thibault, wide-eyed, twitchy, and just slightly too enthusiastic about calligraphy, put the finishing touches on a manuscript so ornate it could give a bishop chest pains. Gold leaf vine work, tiny saints doing backflips through the margins. It's all very holy, very proper. Until you turn a few pages and see it, a drawing of a monk mooning a bishop. Tiny, hidden in the corner, right next to a quote from St. Augustine. Welcome to the story of the manuscript that went too far, and how Brother Thibault's creative liberties got art banned from holy books for over a century. Now, let's be fair, medieval scribes were artists. Long before the printing press, every book was a handmade treasure, copied by monks, often over years. These weren't just dry texts. Illuminated manuscripts were bursting with colour, gold and life. The margins were where scribes let loose, small sketches, little beasts, bizarre jokes. Picture a Bible with a full-page depiction of the crucifixion, and in the bottom right corner a snail jousting a knight. Standard stuff. But Thibault? He raised the stakes. He started modestly. Cheeky rabbits, cross-eyed angels, a nun riding a chicken. But as his confidence grew, so did the chaos. Eventually his illuminations took over entire pages. Saints with exaggerated muscles. Apostles with suspiciously modern haircuts. A full page devoted to what he called the Dance of the Joyful Martyrs, which featured a conga line of holy men wearing only socks. Nobody noticed for a while, because the head librarian, Brother Evo, was nearly blind and thought everything looked delightfully expressive. But eventually a visiting archdeacon picked up Thibault's latest manuscript, turned to the Song of Solomon, and found an illustration of two monks dramatically spooning in a tree, watched by an owl with a judgmental expression. The book was confiscated immediately. Word spread fast. The archdeacon was appalled. The bishop was apoplectic. One of the higher-ranking abbots described the illustrations as an attack on modesty, theology, and artistic restraint, and banned Thibault from ever drawing another butt in the name of the Lord. The offending manuscript was burned in a solemn ceremony, and Thibault was exiled to a rural priory where he spent the rest of his days illuminating copies of agricultural reports. His sheep looked incredible. Here's your historical fact. Marginalia, the weird, wonderful art found in the margins of medieval manuscripts, was a real thing, and it got very strange. Scholars have catalogued thousands of bizarre images: nuns fighting rabbits, cats playing bagpipes, men giving birth to snails, don't ask. While most were playful or symbolic, some got suggestive, and occasionally they crossed the line, usually when satire got too pointed or anatomy got too detailed. After the Thibault incident, or whatever similar event inspired it, records are vague, a wave of censorship swept through several monastic scriptoria. A decree was issued. All decorative illustration in sacred texts must be directly relevant to the content and reviewed by a senior cleric prior to inclusion. In other words, no more mooning monks, no more lewd marginalia, no more theological humour, which, to be fair, had gotten very specific. This sparked a miniature rebellion among scribes. Some protested by drawing increasingly passive-aggressive animals, bears scowling in the margins, dogs side-eyeing saints, birds making the medieval equivalent of fart faces. Others snuck in secret messages using illuminated initials, like one passage from Psalms where the first letter of every verse spelled out, "Io Saturn laugheth." Nobody knew what it meant, but it felt threatening. The quirky twist? Some scribes went underground. They began producing unofficial manuscripts, hidden in monastery cellars, exchanged secretly between abbeys, filled with outrageous art. One collection, discovered centuries later, contained a medieval bestiary with creatures like the flatulent unicorn and the sobbing owl of truth. Another featured a satirical book of saints where every martyr had a wildly inappropriate superpower, like levitation via burp or weaponized weeping. Even more controversial were the double books, volumes that looked like standard Bibles on the surface, but when flipped upside down revealed entirely different text, complete with deeply questionable illustrations. Think theological Mad Libs meets interpretive dance, but on parchment. Meanwhile, the official manuscripts got duller. Art was stripped away, replaced with strict columns of text and only the most basic floral borders. Some monks mourned the loss. Others, mostly older ones with shaky hands and a dislike for whimsy, declared it a return to discipline. But for readers, something was lost. Books stopped being living documents full of personality and became vacant slabs of solemnity. As for Brother Thibault, he eventually found peace designing mosaic floor tiles, which he reportedly covered in tiny images of ducks flipping off lions. His work was later rediscovered and praised for its devotional whimsy. One art historian called him the Banksy of the Benedictines, which feels both wrong and completely perfect. So next time you see a beautifully illustrated book, or doodle something weird in the corner of your notebook, think of the monks who came before you, hunched over their desks, determined to inject just a little absurdity into eternity. Because once upon a time, one monk's overly enthusiastic bottom sound sketch changed the way sacred books were made. All because the margins were too much fun to ignore. You're leaning against the back wall of a dimly lit tavern, the kind with uneven wooden floors, sticky tables, and a permanent haze of wood smoke and body odour that no amount of sage bundles will ever fix. A bard is tuning a lute in the corner, mugs are clinking, and the smell of roasting meat almost hides the more suspicious odours wafting from the back room. At a corner table sits a man swaying slightly, red-faced, sweat dripping from his brow. He slams back a final gulp of golden liquid, stands on the bench and bellows, "Let the truth be sung!" And that's when everything unravels. This is the moment mead madness became legend, when one bard's drunken rampage at a royal celebration didn't just ruin a feast, but kicked off a national panic, a round of sweeping regulations, and the formal creation of a medieval drinking age. Because apparently all it takes is one guy, one goblet of honey wine too many, and a little too much honesty set to music. Let's meet the man behind the mess. Luther the Lyric, a travelling bard known for three things: his enchanting voice, his incredibly thick beard, and his complete lack of an internal filter. Luther had performed in noble courts across the region. He was known for cheeky ballads and clever satire. and more than a few lords had blushed while hearing their own scandal sung back at them in rhyming couplets, but everyone tolerated him because the man could sing like a saint being tickled by angels. Then came the wedding feast of Crown Prince Edric. The palace had been preparing for months. The guest list spanned kingdoms. The kitchen staff cooked for days straight. Barrels of mead were rolled in from across the countryside, aged, spiced, honeyed to perfection. It was meant to be a night of elegance, diplomacy, and very careful political smiling. And then someone handed Luther a mug of Ember Gold, a new mead brewed by the prince's personal vintner, sweet, strong, and dangerously smooth. One mug turned into two into 6. By the time Luther stumbled onto the banquet table with a lute in one hand and a chicken leg in the other, everyone thought it was just an impromptu performance. It was not. His song began with a sweet verse about love and fidelity. Then came verse 2, the groom's blushing lies. Verse 3 detailed the bride's many adventures before marriage, including one involving a monk, a ladder, and a pear. He paused only to belch dramatically. Verse 4 took a sharp political turn, accusing half the lords in attendance of bribery, nepotism, and poorly concealed wigs. By verse 6, a lady fainted. The prince tried to wrestle the lute away. Luther swung it like a sword and declared, "If I must fall, let it be in song." Security tackled him somewhere between verses 7 and 8, though not before he shouted a rather specific insult about the queen's teeth that haunted her for years. The next morning, the kingdom woke up hungover and mortified. Here's your historical fact. While mead might seem quaint of today, in the Middle Ages, it was one of the most potent and respected alcoholic drinks available. Fermented honey, water, and herbs, sometimes aged for years, it was the drink of warriors, poets, and troublemakers. Its strength varied wildly, and in many places there were no laws limiting who could drink it. Children had it watered down for breakfast. Bards, they drank it like it was salary. After the Luther incident, everything changed. The Crown issued a swift proclamation. No one under the age of 21 shall consume mead in royal or public settings. It was the first known instance of a formal drinking age tied to a specific beverage. Tavern owners were required to keep drink ledgers. Mead brewers had to certify their batches weren't too volatile. Bards, specifically, were banned from accepting free drinks during performances. One minister called it the Sing Sober Act. The bard community was livid. They claimed Luther had been provoked, that someone slipped him extra strong mead on purpose, knowing he couldn't resist an encore. One theory suggests a rival performer poisoned the batch with a hallucinogenic herb called dream root, used by forest shamans. Another insists the entire event was a plot to distract from a brewing tax scandal, which, honestly, tracks. But the quirky part, Luther became a folk hero. Though he was imprisoned for vocal treason, ballads based on his ballads spread like wildfire. Secret tavern performances reenacted his infamous verses. The Queen's teeth became a drinking game. Someone carved his lyrics into a tree in the royal gardens. Peasants, who saw him as a truth-teller, began calling strong mead Luther's tongue. He was eventually released on the condition that he would never sing in royal territory again. He toured the countryside instead, performing under fake names like Sir Drink-a-Lot and the Honeyed Hammer. At one performance he opened with, "My lute is sober, but my spirit is not." He was tackled before the second line. Meanwhile, the drinking age law stuck around. Over time it expanded. Ale, cider, wine. Eventually even watered-down beer were added to the list. Monasteries grumbled. Nobles smuggled in tasting sips for their kids. But taverns started checking ages by the number of winters survived, and getting caught serving strong mead to someone too young could cost you your license, or at least your best barrel. So next time you raise a glass and toast to truth, love, or just surviving Tuesday, spare a moment for Luther, the bard who sang what everyone was thinking, who drank way more than anyone should, and who made it officially illegal to get too honest over mead. Because in the Middle Ages, one man's hangover could change policy for generations. You're standing in a blacksmith's workshop surrounded by heat, hammering, and the smell of singed leather and man-sweat, so potent it could be declared a biological weapon. Sparks fly from the anvil like tiny fireflies on meth. And in the middle of it all stands Master Heydrich, shirtless, scarred, grinning like someone who just discovered a new way to make pain fashionable. In his hands, a freshly forged suit of armour, polished to a mirror shine, and bristling with metal spikes. Welcome to the day fashion and function collided at full speed and gave birth to the spiked armour scandal, a brief, glorious and utterly disastrous moment in medieval history when one overly enthusiastic blacksmith nearly turned battlefield gear into a war crime and got innovative armour banned across half the continent. Let's go back a bit. By the late 1300s, armour had become both a military necessity and a status symbol. Knights didn't just want to survive, they wanted to look good while doing it. Artisans competed to make the most ornate designs, etched patterns, line-shaped pauldrons, helmets with faceplates shaped like snarling dogs. It was the golden age of wearable intimidation. But Heydrich of Dornshelm, he wanted more. Former tournament fighter turned weaponsmith, Heydrich was famous for pushing the line between craftsmanship and madness. His shop had a 3-year waitlist and a reputation for turning out armour that looked like something a dragon would wear to prom. He made gauntlets with retractable claws, helmets that whistled in the wind, and chainmail so fine you could fold it into your pocket, assuming you wanted to carry around 40 pounds of sharp metal in your trousers. Then came his masterpiece, the hedgehog suit. Inspired by nature's most stabby creature, Heydrich crafted a full set of plate armour covered in sharp steel spikes, shoulder spikes, elbow spikes, knee spikes, even butt spikes. He claimed it offered complete 360-degree defence. Can't be stabbed if you're already the stabber, he said. The first person to wear it was Lord Varick of Glenbray, a young noble who'd inherited his title, his horse, and not a single drop of critical thinking. He commissioned the suit for a royal jousting event, convinced it would both intimidate opponents and redefine knightly fashion. Spoiler, it did, but not in the way he wanted. At first, the crowd was impressed. Varick strutted into the arena looking like a porcupine that had swallowed a chandelier. The armour gleamed, the spikes glittered, one lady fainted. A bard tried to rhyme lethal with beautiful and failed miserably. Then the match began. Varick mounted his horse with difficulty, spikes and saddles don't mix, and rode toward his opponent. The lances collided, and somehow both knights survived the initial pass. But when Varick dismounted, or rather fell off his horse because he couldn't balance, things escalated. He rolled, and every time he rolled, he stabbed something. First, he accidentally impaled his own squire, who had rushed in to help. Then, when he tried to stand, he backed into a fellow noble's steed. The horse panicked, reared up, kicked a merchant in the face and broke a fruit cart. 2 more people were injured trying to stop him from moving. By the end of the tournament, the only blood drawn was from spectators and staff. Varick called it a success. The court called it a catastrophe. Within the week, a royal decree was issued. No more protruding armour modifications without official approval, which, of course, meant a full review committee. 5 elderly knights who thought anything newer than a chainmail tunic was sorcery and pride. Here's your historical fact. Armour design was regulated in certain periods, especially for tournaments where safety and spectacle mattered. Blunted weapons were used. Rules about weight and structure were enforced. And yes, there were bans on excessive adornment and modifications deemed dangerously impractical. The goal was to prevent exactly the kind of nonsense Heydrich had unleashed. But Heydrich wasn't finished. Furious at the ban, he claimed the injuries were user error, and began selling smaller modular spike kits under the table. Elbow spikes, shin spikes, even codpiece spikes, each marketed as surprise deterrents. He sold dozens before being fined and publicly scolded by the Guild of Armourers, who declared him a menace to ergonomic design. The quirky part? Some knights loved it. They saw spiked armour as a form of psychological warfare. A few tried to claim it was blessed, that the spikes channeled divine wrath. One particularly eccentric baron had his entire retinue outfitted in matching spiked cloaks, which resulted in 3 horses refusing to ride beside them, and a priest accidentally stabbed during a blessing. Eventually the movement collapsed under its own pointy weight. After several incidents, one involving a knight getting stuck inside his own tent, another where 2 spiked nobles hugged and couldn't separate, authorities cracked down. The ban was extended to include any armour likely to pierce, puncture or otherwise cause injury to the wearer, allies, or innocent bystanders. That last one was added after a bishop slipped on spilled wine and fell onto a seated viscount who was wearing a full spiked chestplate. Neither man walked right again. As for Heydrich, he went underground, started crafting performance pieces for noble masquerades. armour that looked dangerous but was made of painted wood and goose feathers. Later in life, he opened a gallery of failed prototypes called the Museum of Painful Ideas. His last known invention, a helmet with extendable side horns meant to knock out enemies during a headbutt. It knocked out 2 testers and a sheep. He retired soon after. So next time you see a medieval suit of armour gleaming in a museum, smooth and polished and perfectly practical, remember, there was once a time when fashion went full murder cactus. All it took was one overly ambitious blacksmith, a noble with zero self-preservation instinct, and a few dozen unintended injuries to make armour safety a very real concern. You're passing by a stone chapel on the outskirts of a quiet village when you hear a sound so strange, so utterly out of place you stop mid-step. A flute. But not just any flute. A breathy, sinuous melody that winds its way out of an open window and slides into your brain like warm honey. It's beautiful, hypnotic, slightly indecent. You move closer, peering in, and see the source, a young music tutor, his fingers dancing along the polished wood of a handmade recorder, eyes closed into rapture. Across from him, 6 students, both boys and girls, sit transfixed, expressions somewhere between admiration and emotional confusion. That tutor, his name is Tomlin, and he's the reason flutes were banned in schools across the realm. Because this isn't just a music lesson. It's the opening number of a scandal that got so out of hand it forced a full rethink of music education, co-ed classrooms, and what kinds of wind instruments were safe for the soul. Now let's be clear, medieval music teachers were often seen as eccentric but harmless. Most were church-trained, tasked with teaching basic liturgical melodies, courtly songs, and maybe a few folk tunes if the headmaster wasn't listening. Instruments were basic, lutes, rebecks, fiddles, and students usually just tried not to cry when they missed a note. But Tomlin, he was different. He'd trained in Italy, or so he claimed, and arrived in the northern duchy with an exotic accent, too much hair, and a collection of handmade flutes that gleamed like silver snakes. Within weeks, he had become the most popular instructor in 3 counties. Parents clamoured to get their children into his lessons. Lords invited him to perform at banquets. One countess, who reportedly hadn't smiled since her wedding, laughed out loud during his rendition of The Shepherd's Whisper. The trouble began with a melody. It was called The Lark Beneath the Moon, a composition of Tomlin's own creation. Soft, lilting, emotional, in ways no one could quite articulate. After one performance, several students claimed to have felt their hearts bloom. One boy said he understood love and sadness at the same time. A girl wrote a poem in Latin that made her tutor cry. It was all very poetic, and very, very distracting. Soon, students were skipping other lessons to attend flute sessions. One priest accused the music room of spiritually moistening the youth. A local girl refused her betrothal after attending 3 weeks of class, claiming she would never love a man the way she loved a C-sharp, and something was clearly up. Then came the final performance. It was meant to be an innocent spring recital. Parents arrived dressed in their best, smiling, expecting awkward scales and maybe a half-hearted folk song. What they got instead was 20 students standing barefoot in a circle, eyes closed, flutes raised like ceremonial wands. The piece was new, slow, dreamy, and then, suddenly, intimate. Too intimate. People started squirming. A baroness gasped. Someone dropped a ham, and then, as the music reached its soft, breathy climax, one noble's teenage son stood up mid-performance and declared, "I am in love with music, with life, and with Verena of House Holdrake." Verena fainted on the spot. Her father threw a chair. Tomlin kept playing. The fallout was immediate. A full investigation was launched. Tomlin was interrogated by a panel of church officials, most of whom had never actually heard a flute played well, and found it unnaturally suggestive. One accused him of invoking dangerous harmonics. Another swore he saw witchcraft in the fingering. It wasn't clear whether they meant music or something else, and no one wanted to ask. Here's your historical fact. Musical instruments were occasionally regulated or even banned in religious and educational contexts during the Middle Ages. Certain melodies were considered too secular, and instruments associated with dance or emotional arousal, like the flute, were viewed with suspicion. The church often feared music that stirred the body or emotions too deeply. And yes, there were actual orders that limited the use of wind instruments of excessive breath. So came the decree: flutes, recorders, and any instruments deemed emotionally provocative were banned from the educational settings. Music classes were to focus on chant, vocal harmony, and respectable strings, no solos, no improvisation, and definitely no lark beneath the moon. The quirky twist? Tomlin wasn't charged with a crime, he was too slippery for that. He vanished overnight, leaving behind only his collection of flutes and a series of unsigned love poems hidden inside his music scores. He was later rumoured to be playing in Venice under the alias Silvano Dell'Aria, charming widows and composing ballets inspired by cloud patterns. One particularly bold rumour claimed he joined a secret guild of musicians dedicated to emotional awakening through melody. No one could better confirm this. Everyone hoped it was true. As for the students, they were reassigned. Flutes were destroyed in ceremonial burnings. One student was caught hiding hers in the chimney and was sentenced to write "Chant is Enough" 500 times. Emotional expression in music was reframed as dangerous, indulgent, and suspiciously Italian. But the melodies lingered. People hummed them quietly in the fields. Lovers passed transcriptions hidden inside folded letters. A bishop was caught whistling "The Lark Beneath the Moon" while pruning his vineyard. And one wandering minstrel reported hearing a flute solo on the wind near an old chapel, played with such aching beauty that it made her weep into her boots. So next time you hear a flute solo that makes you feel a little too much, remember Tomlin, the tutor who played too well, stirred too many hearts, and got an entire generation's instrument taken away in the name of modesty and control. All for a few notes. And a really, really good C-sharp. You're in a grand banquet hall, the kind with banners hanging from vaulted ceilings and way too many candles burning way too close to flammable drapery. The long tables are set with pewter plates, decorative trenchers, and golden goblets heavy enough to double as murder weapons. Minstrels play something vaguely pleasant in the corner, while servants weave through the crowd with steaming dishes, platters of roasted game, glazed fruits, and, pride of place, a giant copper cauldron of soup. Ah, the soup course. Harmless, right? Wrong. Because tonight's soup is going to change history, not because of its flavour, but because it's about to be used as a vehicle for vengeance. You're about to witness Soupgate, the slow simmering scandal that led to all soups being temporarily banned from royal banquets across the Eastern Kingdoms. All because one noblewoman decided poison worked best when served with croutons. Let's meet her. Lady Bristler of Thornbridge, courtier, social climber, and, depending on who you ask, either a master of subtlety or the worst criminal to ever hide poison in a consommé. Bristler wasn't noble by birth. She married into status after seducing a minor lord with her impressive embroidery and clever use of perfume. She quickly made her way into court life, where she dazzled with her sharp tongue, even sharper cheekbones, and a habit of winning every argument by quoting ancient poets no one else had read. People admired her. People feared her. People definitely whispered about her when she left the room. Now, Brisella had a problem. That problem's name was Lord Wenton of Ellesmere, a man so smug, so insufferably charming, and so politically entrenched that he was basically unkillable by normal means. He'd blocked her family's land petition. He'd mocked her accent in court. He once described her as pleasant enough in the way a cold pear is pleasant. Rude, she wanted him gone. But she wasn't stupid. Dueling was too obvious. Knives, too risky. No, Bristler was a dinner party tactician. She knew Wenton's routine, she knew he loved soup, claimed it opened the palate, and once refused to attend a feast that didn't start with it. So she bided her time. And then came the autumn banquet. The dish. A rich leek and onion soup garnished with cream, and just a touch of something extra, a powder derived from monkshood, also known as wolfsbane, subtle, deadly, and, when stirred well, utterly tasteless. Brisella's plan? Elegant. One poisoned bowl placed carefully at Wenton's seat. She had a servant ready. She'd even timed it so he'd be the last served, just in case. Nothing could go wrong, except it did. The servant, nervous, underpaid, and already a few sips into the cooking wine, mixed up the bowls. The poisoned soup was handed to Countess Igreen, a sweet, elderly noblewoman who'd once gifted Brisella a sapphire hairpin and called her a nice little firebrand. She took 2 dainty spoonfuls, smiled, complemented the seasoning, and then keeled over into her trencher. Screams, chaos, a goblet shattered. Someone shouted, "Witch!" before realising they were pointing at a statue. A monk began reciting the last rites in 3 different languages, unsure which one God preferred. Brisella froze. Wenton, still holding his untouched soup, grinned and said, "Well, I never liked leeks anyway." The aftermath was brutal. A full investigation was launched. Dozens were questioned. The soup was tested by royal alchemists, who confirmed the presence of poison. Brisella was arrested within the day, dragged from her chambers still wearing her feast gown. Her defence? "I was aiming for someone worse." She was banished, her title revoked, her lands seized. The servant was flogged, then released after a public statement from the kitchen staff blamed inconsistent ladling protocols. The head cook had a nervous breakdown and opened a tavern in the mountains, where he served only bread and tea. But here's your historical fact. Food poisoning, intentional food poisoning, was a real fear in the medieval world, especially among the nobility. Courts often employed official tasters, and elaborate ceremonies surrounded meals to prevent tampering. Dishes were sometimes marked with ribbons, seals, or personal stamps to ensure the right person received the right portion. And soups, with their communal pots and anonymous ladling, a security nightmare. Following the Thornbridge incident, the Crown issued an emergency proclamation. Soup is henceforth banned from all royal feasts, celebrations, and courtly meals until further notice. A Tun decree added, "This includes bisques, broths, and any sippable stews." Nobles were scandalised. Chefs were outraged. One duchess wept openly into her napkin and whispered, "What will we eat between the fish and the meat course?" And the quirky fallout? Everyone panicked about soup. People began suspecting all liquids. Even wine was treated with suspicion. Tasting rituals became longer and more theatrical. Guests brought their own utensils. One noblewoman arrived with a gilded spoon that locked shut unless she turned a secret dial. At smaller dinners, hosts skipped the first course entirely and apologised profusely for the brothless inconvenience, but eventually a compromise emerged. Soup returned to court, but only under strict rules. It had to be served from individual sealed bowls. A royal taster sampled each dish in full view of the guests. All ingredients had to be listed, approved and blessed by the palace chaplain. And no more ladling. Ever. The word itself was considered impolite conversation for at least a year. As for Brisella, she resurfaced years later under a different name, running a successful herbal apothecary far from the capital. Locals swore by her cold remedies, though no one ever asked what was in them. One traveller claimed she had a secret soup recipe, passed only to those with just cause. So next time you sit down to a warm bowl of soup, take a moment. Appreciate it. Because once, a single mix-up turned dinner into a diplomatic disaster and led to a war on broth that historians still refer to, without irony, as the Soupless Years. You're wandering along the edge of a misty lake just outside the quiet village of Marlbrook when you hear a sound that stops you mid-step, a loud, angry honk. A strange one. Not the usual duckly honk, but something deeper, more indignant. You glance up and see a man sprinting through the reeds with a squirming white swan under his arm, feathers flying, legs flailing, and a face that screams, "This seemed like a good idea 10 seconds ago." It was not. That man is Albin the Tanner, and what he's doing, stealing a royal swan, will soon ignite a localised rebellion, a diplomatic headache, and eventually lead to swan ownership laws so strict that, even today, they're technically still on the books. Let's set the table. In medieval England, swans were more than elegant birds gliding through ponds. They were status symbols, reserved for royalty and a select group of nobles. Swans were considered regal fowl, or, as in literally owned by the crown. You couldn't hunt them, eat them, sell them, or even name them without royal permission. They were tagged with special markings, tiny notches cut into their beaks called swan marks, and annual swan censuses were held to count, catalogue, and protect them. Basically, swans were the feathered equivalent of gold bars in a lake. Albin, however, didn't get the memo. He was a tanner by trade. Tough, practical, and perpetually annoyed by rules that didn't directly involve dead animals. He lived on the edge of the royal hunting grounds and had watched the swans paddle by for years. Fat, serene, arrogant. He was sure they were mocking him. More importantly, he was sure no one would notice if one went missing. So he set a trap. Not a clever one, just a big net, some bread soaked in ale, and a half-hour of swearing. But somehow it worked. The bird stumbled into the net, confused, and Albin, thrilled with himself, ran home with what he described later as an extremely heavy victory. He didn't eat it. That would have been quick. No, Albin decided to keep the swan. Tied it up in his yard, bragged about it at the tavern, named it Giles, claimed it had chosen him. He even started charging children a penny to feed it. He had it for 4 full days before anyone noticed. Then the Royal Swan Warden came knocking. Yes, that was a real job. Royal Swanherd, or Keeper of the King's Swans, they took their duties very seriously. When Giles was discovered flapping angrily in Albin's muddy pen, the arrest was immediate. No trial, no explanation, just shackles, an insult about Swanish arrogance, and a trip to the castle. But Albin had fans. By now the entire village of Marlbrook had been feeding Giles, petting Giles, and most dangerously developing affection for Giles. When word got out that the crown had reclaimed him, people were furious. They saw it not as the restoration of royal property, but the seizure of a beloved local mascot. A swan-shaped everyman, an icon, and thus began the Great Swan Uprising of 1421. It started small, graffiti on the castle walls, messages like "Let Giles swim free" and "Down with royal birds." Then came the protests. Villagers wore white feathers in their hats. They flooded the moat with bread to encourage swan defection. Someone even carved a wooden Giles and set it afloat, prompting a guard to dive in and try to arrest it. The court was not amused. To avoid further unrest, the Crown issued a clarification. Swan ownership was to be limited strictly to the monarch and officially licensed landowners. All swans in unregulated areas were to be rounded up, tagged and relocated. Anyone found harbouring fugitive swans would be fined, jailed or forced to scrub the royal boats with a toothbrush. And yes, that last punishment was used. Here's your historical fact. In England, swans were indeed considered royal property as early as the 12th century. The laws surrounding them were shockingly detailed. The annual swan-upping tradition, still practiced today, involved boats of officials rowing down the Thames, catching swans, tagging them and counting their numbers. Ownership required registration. Unauthorised possession could lead to harsh penalties. It was, and remains, one of the strangest examples of wildlife regulation in history. Back to Albin. After 2 weeks in the dungeon, he was released on the condition that he never speak of Giles again. He returned home to a hero's welcome and immediately began crafting leather swan figurines that sold out within hours. He never caught another swan, but he did name his dog Giles the Scarecrow. The original swan, for the record, was relocated to the Royal Lake at Windsor. According to some reports, he became extremely antisocial and attacked several noble children. One court chronicler wrote, "The beast remembers the taste of liberty and does not forgive." Meanwhile, swan panic spread. Peasants feared accidentally owning one. Bakers stopped making swan-shaped bread. Children were told, "Don't touch that bird unless you want your hands chopped off." One unfortunate inn had to repaint its sign from the proud swan to the slightly embarrassed duck. The quirky part? Despite the drama, a cult of admiration grew around the incident. Giles became a symbol of local pride. Songs were written. One bard composed the Ballad of Giles the People's Swan, which included the line, "Though bound in rope, his soul did float." A small festival was held every spring featuring wooden swan races and a ceremonial net burning. Scholars now debate whether the uprising was truly about swans or a deeper resentment toward royal property laws. Some suggest it was the first grassroots protest over animal rights. Others just think the villagers were drunk and bored. Whatever the cause, the legacy stuck. To this day, if you're walking near certain rivers in England and see a swan, remember, you're probably looking at royal property. You technically can't pet it. You definitely can't keep it. And if you try to name it Giles, well, someone might remember. So next time you see a swan gliding smugly through a pond, just know. One man's bad decision to steal a bird for bragging rights triggered a rebellion, rewrote animal laws, and made a very angry goose relative a permanent piece of royal bureaucracy. You're standing in the middle of a dusty medieval field camp, banners flapping in the wind, tents pitched in uneven rows, and men sharpening swords with the enthusiasm of children told they'll get pudding if they finish their homework early. There's a strange tension in the air. Part battle readiness, part sleep deprivation, part why does this stew smell like wet dog? But more than anything, there's talk about the banners, specifically the wrong ones. At first glance, they seem ordinary. Richly dyed cloths bearing lions, crosses, ravens, whatever grim animal or symbol your noble house declared looked intimidating, stitched onto linen. But then someone notices something off. A phrase, a symbol, a bird flying the wrong direction, a star added where none should be. And just like that, chaos. This is the story of the banner betrayal, a case of treason sewn in silk to a silent act of sabotage so elegant and petty it led to a total overhaul in military banner production and got every flag maker in the region put under royal surveillance for the next 3 generations. Let's roll it back. Banners in the medieval world were a big deal. Not just decoration, they were identifiers, rallying points, and often the only thing keeping a knight from accidentally stabbing his own cousin in the melee fog of war. A banner told you where your people were, who was in charge, and, just as importantly, where not to go if you didn't want to get your face restructured. So when Lord Arvin of Westcross rode into the Battle of Grosvenor and saw his banner, bright blue with a silver griffin, already flying over the ridge where the enemy army was waiting, he understandably panicked. It didn't make sense. That was his banner. And same stitching, same frayed corner, same slightly embarrassing griffin that looked like it had skipped leg day. His men were confused. Was it a trick? Were they already over the ridge? Had they teleported? Was this the Lord's doing? No. It was worse. Someone had copied the banner perfectly, then flown it over the enemy camp, luring Lord Arvin's forces into thinking their allies had already claimed the position. They marched straight toward them, flags raised high, expecting a warm welcome. They got spears instead. The Westcross flank was shredded in less than an hour, and Arvin himself was unseated, captured, and allegedly had to trade a family heirloom, and an extremely reluctant son for release. Back at court, the scandal erupted. An investigation was launched into how exactly an enemy force had acquired a flawless copy of an official banner. That kind of detail wasn't available to just anyone. It had to come from inside the house. Enter Elberna, master embroiderer, royal flag maker, and very tired widow with an eye twitch that could slice stone. She confessed immediately, not because she felt guilty, but because, as she put it, if I wanted it done right, I had to do it myself. Turns out Elberna had been harbouring a grudge against Lord Arvin for years. He'd commissioned a massive tapestry from her late husband, then refused to pay after claiming it made his nose look a touch ambitious. He'd cost her coin, reputation, and, according to her, 2 good spools of gold thread. So when the enemy came looking for banner makers with coin and a quiet tongue, Elberna offered her services with the cold calm of a woman who had nothing to lose and a pattern memorised. She stitched an exact replica, even aged it, added the same wine stain on the edge, then handed it over, saying, "Tell them to hang it just before dawn, trust me, he'll see it." And she was right. Here's your historical fact. While rare, military deception via heraldry did happen. During conflicts like the 100 Years' War, there were cases of falsified crests, misleading banners, or enemy forces disguising themselves in colours meant to trick opponents into hesitation or retreat. Since identification was largely visual, it made these tactics incredibly effective and dangerous. The betrayal hit hard. The Crown's reaction? Swift and spectacularly paranoid. All military banners were henceforth to be produced only by Crown-licensed embroiderers. Every new design had to be registered, sealed, and double-signed by a herald. Banners had to include hidden stitches, essentially embroidered watermarks, and any flag found without one was considered suspect and potentially treasonous. The Guild of Embroiderers went into full lockdown. Elberna, of course, was arrested, but her story had captured the public imagination. A woman, widowed and overlooked, using the most domestic of tools, needle and thread, to bring a noble lord to his knees. Folk hero status. A ballad titled The Needle's Vengeance made the rounds, featuring such unforgettable lyrics as, "She stitched by night, with spite so tight the banner flew, the knight took flight." People sang it in taverns. One lady embroidered the entire verse onto a pillow, which was later confiscated for encouraging sedition during nap time. Elberna, when asked if she regretted her actions, simply replied, "No, but I do regret how badly that griffin was drawn in the first place." The quirky fallout? Banner making became an elite trade. Embroiderers were sworn to secrecy. Apprentices had to take oaths and undergo background checks. One squire was denied entry into knighthood because his family once misused a pennant. Even battlefield etiquette changed. Generals began sending runners to confirm which banners were real before engaging, leading to several awkward standoffs, and at least one fight that began with both sides yelling, "Do you have the gold stitch under the third feather?" Eventually cooler heads prevailed. The regulations loosened slightly. But the trust, gone. From then on, nobles double-checked every stitch. Some added secret codes, hidden messages in Latin, even drawings only visible under certain kinds of oil. Banner making became part textile art, part espionage. As for Lord Arvin, he never quite lived it down. Soldiers referred to pulling an Arvin when someone marched in the wrong direction. His griffin banner, recovered after the battle, was quietly retired. A new one was made, more muscular, more dramatic, and some say it now includes a tiny stitched tear near the eye. Added by Alberna herself, who later escaped prison using only a bent needle, a spool of horsehair, and an absolutely blistering speech about justice. So next time you see a flag flying proudly, bold and clean in the wind, take a moment to appreciate that it's definitely the right one. Because once upon a time all it took was a grudge, a needle, and a little artistic precision to turn a piece of cloth into the deadliest lie on the battlefield. You're in the candlelit hush of a medieval monastery scriptorium again, yes, again, but this time something feels different. The monks are tense. There's a distinct lack of humming or casual prayer mumbling, and everyone is studiously avoiding eye contact with one particular corner of the room, where a thick wooden cabinet has been chained shut and sealed with wax. No one speaks of it, but you can feel the fear radiating off the walls like a cold draught. Inside the cabinet is a book, not just any book, the Book of Bestial Names, a hand-copied bestiary compiled by a monk named Brother Geoffrey, who may or may not have been entirely sane when he wrote it. And this is the tale of how one man's disturbingly imaginative animal encyclopedia got every creative zoological text banned hard for being dangerous to the mind, the soul, and to at least one bishop who tried to read it backwards. Let's get comfortable. In the Middle Ages, bestiaires were all the rage. Beautifully illustrated, full of both real and completely bonkers animals, they served as both zoological guides and moral instruction. The lion represented Christ. The unicorn, purity. The pelican, weirdly, was used to represent self-sacrifice because people believed it stabbed itself in the chest to feed its young. Don't try that at home. But Brother Gervais, he wasn't content with the classics. He began his bestiary with the standard entries: lion, eagle, ox, phoenix. Then came additions, a lot of additions. Somewhere around page 40, things went off the rails. There was the mourning sheep, said to cry blood whenever someone nearby committed adultery. The reverse dog, which barked in violence and wagged its tail only in the presence of liars. The toad of melancholy, which supposedly whispered bad poetry into people's ears at night. Each entry came with elaborate moral lessons, some of which were suspiciously specific. If you dream of the crimson stoat, consider whether you've been rude to any beekeepers recently. Monks began to worry. The illustrations didn't help. Gervais was no artist, but that didn't stop him from trying. The mourning sheep looked like it had seen every tragedy ever staged. The reverse dog appeared to be vomiting a scroll. The toad of melancholy had human hands and a look of deep personal betrayal. But the real tipping point was when Gervais introduced a creature he called the parable lizard, a six-legged reptile that preached moral sermons from the treetops, pausing only to devour sinners. That got him in trouble. The abbot summoned Gervais for questioning. "Do these animals exist?" he asked. Gervais, without blinking, replied, "They exist in the realm of the mind, which is more vivid than the flesh." That didn't go over well. The abbot called in a bishop, the bishop called in a second bishop. A council was convened, and then someone read the chapter on the serpent of ambiguous doctrine. Apparently, if you spoke its name aloud, it caused nearby monks to argue about the Trinity for hours. The bishop did say the name out loud just to prove it was nonsense, and within 15 minutes, a heated debate broke out in the cloisters about whether the Holy Spirit had knees. From that point on, the book was labelled theologically corrosive. Here's your historical fact. Bestiaries, while rooted in religious instruction, often included wild mythological creatures and local folklore, some of it with questionable connections to scripture. As literacy grew and more monks began copying these texts, the church grew wary of unauthorized interpretations that strayed too far from official doctrine. Several texts were quietly destroyed, and there were real debates about whether certain imagined creatures posed spiritual risks by encouraging improper thought or heretical allegory. Gervais's book wasn't destroyed yet. It was locked up, sealed, and used as a cautionary example for young scribes. He was reassigned to herb gardening, where he allegedly began naming weeds after deadly sins. This nettle is sloth. That dandelion is greed. The scriptorium, meanwhile, underwent a full content review. And then the real crackdown came. New decree. All future bestiaries must be approved by the Office of Natural Order. Only known animals allowed. No imaginary beasts. No creative interpretations. No editorial commentary. Any moral lesson must be accompanied by a scripture. Any mention of lizards preaching was strictly forbidden. The decree added a final line: monks shall not anthropomorphize toads, for therein lies chaos. Creative monks protested quietly. One added a footnote to a wolf entry that simply read, "This animal is real but would be funnier in a hat." He was forced to fast for a week. The quirky twist? Despite the ban, underground bestiaries flourished. Called wild books, they circulated hand-to-hand among monastic rebels. These included creatures like the excuse beetle, which burrowed into confessionals and gave the priest reasons to delay penance, and the midnight cow, which appeared only during fasting hours and mooed judgmentally. Some of the illustrations survive, hidden in marginalia tucked inside psalters, drawn in the shape of decorative initials that no one looked at too closely. And what of Brother Gervais? Years later, a visitor to the Abbey of St. Luden reported seeing an old monk in the gardens talking softly to a clump of moss. When asked what he was doing, the monk replied, "The moss is thinking about pride. I'm just listening." Some say Gervais passed quietly. Others claim he transformed into one of his own creatures, probably the parable lizard, and wandered off into the woods to preach to squirrels. Today, only one known copy of the Book of Bestial Names survives, buried deep in the restricted section of a cathedral archive, locked in a box in a room that smells of mildew and fear. Scholars who read it report strange dreams. One claimed to hear the mourning sheep bleating softly in his sleep. So next time you see an animal looking at you in a way that feels almost human, consider, maybe Brother Gervais was right. Maybe the mind's eye sees deeper than the world allows. Or maybe you're just staring at a goat too long. Either way, never underestimate the power of one monk, one pen, and too much creative freedom during a slow winter. Because once, a single book about imaginary animals was so weird, so unsettling, and so dangerously thought-provoking that it changed the rules of writing forever. And now, as the candle gutters low, and the last echoes of hoofbeats, feathers, and angry soup-related riots fade into the night, let's take a breath. You've made it. Somehow, through all 30 absurd, ridiculous, and entirely real moments when one person ruined it for everyone in the Middle Ages, you've survived cursed banquets, musical misconduct, lethal goats, and emotionally destabilizing flutes. Not bad for a humble bedtime journey. If there's a moral, and let's be honest, it's thin, it might be this. The Middle Ages were messy, gloriously, outrageously messy. People tripped over power, pride, pettiness, and poultry with equal enthusiasm. They created systems only to be undone by their own cousins. They banned things not because they were dangerous, but because one guy just couldn't handle it properly. Sound familiar? Whether it was the scribe who doodled one too many butts, the bard who sang his truth with a belly full of mead, or the noblewoman who misunderstood the basic ethics of soup. It only took one individual, one moment to flip a switch. And when they did, the rules changed. Sometimes overnight, sometimes forever. That's the fun of it. These aren't just dusty names in forgotten chronicles. They were loud, impulsive, wildly human. They were you, if you had access to a warhorse, a questionable sense of badgerment, and absolutely no adult supervision. So as you pull your blanket up to your chin, and the hum of a fan settles into the rhythm of quiet breath, remember, history isn't always shaped by the grand kings or legendary warriors. Sometimes it's just a guy stealing a swan, or a monk with opinions about toads. Thanks for staying with me tonight.